Today's episode is sponsored by Wondery's Exhibit C. Join now by following Wondery Exhibit C on Facebook or find us on the web at wonderyexhibitc.com and listen to true crime podcasts on Wondery and Amazon Music. Exhibit C. It's truly criminal. So my mother and myself decided to visit Nevada City, CA on a whim. It's an old-timey Victorian-era mining or logging town built in 1856. You can look at pictures on Google if you really want to see a creepy town. It looks haunted without even having to try, to be honest. But after eating lunch at a brew pub, we decided to stroll around the massive Pioneer Historical Cemetery on the outskirts of town. It wasn't quite dusk yet, but the trees are really tall in this area, so daylight is hard to gauge, and it usually feels later than it is. This cemetery was sprawling, and I mean, most pioneer cemeteries are because of the high mortality rate of the time, but this had lots of child graves. As we progress through the cemetery, though, it starts like a proper cemetery with large ornate tombs, mausoleums, marble obelisks, family plots, etc. But what's wild about this particular cemetery is that it stretches on almost forever into the woods. Spooky, but this isn't a paranormal story. You see, as we follow the cemetery deeper and deeper into the woods, it becomes hard to tell what's a grave or not, and it's getting more wild and sort of overgrown. It eventually devolved into just wilderness, really, with the occasional sign of homeless camps like abandoned tents, bags of trash, etc. Luckily, the trees were opening up and more daylight was coming through, and we ended up in an open area with a large solitary juniper tree, tall brush, and a few random graves around as well. I sort of tripped over something at some point, and it turned out to be a purse, like a large designer purse, and it looked super old, like it had been there for a while. Looking up from the purse about maybe 10 yards ahead, I saw what looked like a pile of women's clothing, but then I noticed, to my horror, a tangled mass of hair, and at that, I froze. You ever know something without actually knowing something? I knew that this was a dead woman's body, down to my core. I put a hand out and stopped my mum, who was trailing behind me. "Get your phone, call the police. That's a dead body over there." And she immediately started dialing 911 because, like me, she just knew too. But this is where it just gets crazy. You see, as my mum and I are discussing the situation, we had our attention turned away from the corpse. When we looked back at the body, I swear that she was sitting up with her back turned to us. She was wearing a bright red trench coat, and she had super grimy blonde hair that was more standing up than laying on her shoulders. It's like the grime in her hair allowed it to sort of defy gravity, if you catch my drift, and slowly, she turned her head over her shoulder like something out of a horror movie and spotted us. She literally jumped to her feet lightning fast and turned to face us. Her front was a mess of torn clothing and she was barely covered. In the weirdest gait that I'd ever seen, she rapidly advanced on us in a jerking, sort of lurching fashion. Her hands were desperately trying to keep herself covered. My first thought was that she had been assaulted. She kept trying to speak to us, but it was like she couldn't form words, only make sort of high-pitched squeaks. As she closed in on me, she stopped and pointed down in excitement at the purse that I had tripped over. I asked if it was hers, and when I did, her expression changed into a horrible smirk. It still haunts me when I think of it, and suddenly she was slowly starting to undress herself, and we had to shout to her to stop it. By this point, we had the cops on the way. The dispatcher had heard everything, and we said that we had found someone in serious distress. Be that as it may, we both knew that it was not a safe situation for us, and we quickly backed away, turned, and we booked it out of there. When we eventually followed up with the police out of concern, and to be honest, curiosity too, they said that whoever we had found, they must have fled because they never did find her. I really do hope to God that whoever that person was, that she's okay and that she gets the help that she needs, because she was obviously not all there. So my fiance and I hiked into some forest in Ontario one time. We had a friend drop us off at the side of an old logging road in the middle of nowhere, and we hiked into the woods due east. The road, it ran north-south, so basically all we had to do was stay due east hiking in and due west hiking out, and we would reach the road again for our rendezvous at a predetermined time a couple of days later. Now, there are no natural predators this far south, such as bears or wolves, so for protection, I only really brought a K-bar knife and some bear spray, in case coyotes took an interest in our two dogs that accompanied us. The logging road was no longer in use by any industry, and we had hiked into the woods a few kilometers, so the chances of running into another human were pretty much nil. In addition, hunting is not permitted in this area, and there is no water nearby for fishing either. There really wasn't any reason for anyone else to be out there in the middle of the woods that far off the road, is what I'm getting at. There's also no cell service, although I did bring a flare gun and multiple flares in case we ran into trouble to signal for help. No GPS, just a compass. We were careful hiking in and didn't do anything risky to avoid injuries in this remote place. It was nearly fall, but it was unseasonably cold that day, well below freezing. Lots of leaves on the ground and still on the trees, but no snow yet. We set up camp in some thick woods. You could barely see 50 feet away. The trees or bushes were so dense. We were totally isolated, and honestly, we felt completely safe. It was so cold though and so dark at night, it was moonless and cloudy, that we went to bed early to stay warm. I'm a heavy sleeper too, and the next thing that I remember is I'm awakened by my dog pawing at my face. It's pitch black and I can't even see him. I go to pet him, but something's wrong. As I touched him, I could feel his fur standing straight up, and he was completely rigid, facing the door of the tent. He was clearly on guard and very alert. At first, I assumed that there was a woodland creature nearby, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That is unusual because I often camp alone, no problem, and I'm not really easily spooked, I guess you could say. My dog and I just stayed there frozen though and alert for at least a couple of minutes. My fiancé and other dog were still fast asleep next to us. It was 3:30 in the morning. I checked my phone after the incident. The fire was out, no moon, and it was complete darkness. But just as I was letting my guard down, I hear the most unexpected thing. A notification going off on a phone just outside of our tent, maybe 15 to 20 feet away, and I also see a faint glow. I hear a male voice mutter, "Oh no," or something to that effect, and hear them running through the leaves away from our tent. They were clearly smacking into tree branches too, and swearing as they did so. At this point, they turn on their flashlight as they run, and I can see the beam flailing wildly around in the woods, occasionally back into our tent. The dogs start going absolutely ballistic. I grab my knife and look at my phone. It's 3:30. I screamed out, "If you come back here, I'll blow your head off." I'm assuming that he had a satellite phone or really good cell service to get notification like that. The other weird thing, though, was that he fled deeper into the woods and nothingness, not towards the west where the logging road was. Well, needless to say, we packed up in the cold and we hiked back to the road that night, watching our backs the entire time. We just walked down the road towards far-off civilization until we ran into some other campers set up right next to the road, 7 or 8 kilometers away from where we came out of the woods. It was just after first light when we made it there. They let us use their satellite phone, and we called our friend to come and pick us up a day early. And upon hearing our story, the campers decided that they would pack up as well and get out of the area too. It was a lesson learned, and I do not camp in the wilderness anymore without a satellite phone and at least a 12 gauge. So the past 2 nights I slept with my blinds open without realizing that they were, because I leave for work when it's dark out and come home when it's dark out too. The past 2 nights I kept waking up over and over, and I recently moved here and was told jokingly but also seriously that I'm in Wendigo country. This morning I was outside scraping the ice off my car and all of a sudden the street lamp went off. The motion sensor lights in the garage turned off, and there were also no lights in any of the houses on the street. Suddenly I had this super intense fight or flight feeling and audibly said nope, and got in my car and made sure not to look outside the windows. Something in me was saying not to look outside at all. The lights all came back on a few moments later, and I no longer felt that primal fear. It was weird, but it was nothing to write home about, I admit. And well, on the way home tonight, I saw something out the corner of my eye run beside my car along the shoulder of the highway on my passenger side, and felt that primal fear settle in again. I tried to tell myself that I was just scaring myself and to let it go, but as I was driving, I couldn't not look outside. Plus, I had to watch out for deer, so I couldn't just mindlessly look straight forward anyway. When I turned off the highway and onto my exit, I felt even more fear, and I was now off the main road with no lights other than my headlights. I again tried to shake it off, but as I pulled onto the street to the house, I heard what sounded like either a very loud exhale or maybe a really loud whisper, but it sounded like it was just outside of my car, if that makes sense. I pulled into the driveway shakily, and as I put the car in park and turned it off, I saw something again from the corner of my eye on the other side of my roommate's vehicle. It very quickly dashed off, and whatever it was tall, but I didn't really get a good look at it, so I'm not sure exactly how tall, but it was big, whatever it was. But suddenly, I felt watched from every direction and felt terrified to even turn my car off, knowing that I had to walk a few feet into the house. But with it being 8 degrees outside, I couldn't just stay in the car all night. So I ran in as quickly as I could and instantly felt safer once I crossed the threshold. The house had been cleansed due to previous paranormal experiences, but as soon as I got to my room and saw my blinds open, I felt extremely scared again. I pulled the blinds down quickly, and in the time that I've been writing this, I've been hearing something brush up against the house outside, sometimes quietly and other times actually quite loudly. Sure, it is windy, but there's nothing physically close to the house that could be brushing up against the outer walls like that. And my eyes keep being drawn to the window as well. I don't know what I saw on either occurrence, but I do know that I feel like something is waiting to get me and watching me. I've always been super sensitive to things most people can't see, and this is the first time that I've felt this much fear here, ever. Even inside, I just don't feel safe anymore, and I don't know. What do you guys think that I should do about it? Also, when I opened my blinds the next morning, leading back to where I saw the thing by my roommate's car, there are some rather big footprints. Here's a picture of them. From the creators of Dr. Death, Scamfluers, and Over My Dead Body, Wondery goes deeper into complex true crime stories to give you an inside look at the facts. And now, Wondery is launching the ultimate true crime fan destination, Exhibit C. It's truly criminal. Dive deep into the most devious scams, manipulative cults, and the coldest of cases. Wondery's Exhibit C lets you view all the evidence through a detective's lens, taking you step by step through the twists and turns of each true crime case. Join the Exhibit C online community to access exclusive show merchandise, member-only content, and to hear directly from top criminal and social justice experts, witnesses, and investigators as they take us beyond the evidence and into the case file. Now, as someone who loves true crime podcasts and is a pretty big fan of some of the titles featured on Exhibit C, I seriously love this collective hub and community that they've created here. Some of my favorites are The Vanished and Killer Psyche, and I'm really happy to see them included within the lineup. I'm loving the fact that all of these podcasts can now be found in just one spot, and it's never been easier to find another true crime podcast to binge through. And believe me, I intend to binge. So, join now by following Wondery Exhibit C on Facebook or find us on the web at wonderyexhibitc.com and listen to true crime podcasts on Wondery and Amazon Music. Exhibit C. It's truly criminal. So, I didn't grow up in a very good area. I won't give the location for privacy's sake, but I live in a fairly large city and at the time I was around 10 or 11. This was overall not a good area, like I said. Lots of gang activity, drug use, that kind of thing. One of those neighborhoods with the jacked up sidewalks and shopping carts strewn everywhere sort of vibe. But there was a park a couple of blocks away from my house, and I decided to go on a run and spend some time there on my own. I don't know why I was allowed to leave on my own, to be honest, knowing the area, but it was still light out when I jogged down there. But it started getting dark when I actually reached the park. It was around dusk. The layout of the park too was a big sort of rectangle basically. It faced out long ways, so the shorter side was there where the gate was. It's hard to explain, but I hope you all get it. Now, there was a large set of swings at the very front, and I sat down to hang out there for a bit. At the time, I didn't have a phone with service, I just had music downloaded to listen to. I was sitting with my earbuds in and just got this really awful feeling all of a sudden. It felt like a tingling on the back of my neck, and I knew something was up. I took one earbud out and kept swinging, but I couldn't shake that feeling. Finally, I turned around to check behind me, and there was an alleyway leading into the park that sort of curved, so you could only see part of the way down. It was all white gravel, and down the alley was a dumpster. And there was a figure on the ground with what I can only describe as a ton of red stuff around him, which, looking back, I now know was a lot of blood, and another guy standing or walking towards me quickly. The alley was across the playground, about 40 feet away maybe, and as soon as I saw the man approaching me, I dipped out of there as quickly as I could. He definitely had something in his hands that I couldn't really see, but he was holding it like a knife or a pair of scissors, I would guess. I sprinted the couple blocks away back to my house, and I got in through the back to make sure that nobody saw me. I'm not sure if he followed me, but I could have sworn that I heard running at one point. I didn't tell my dad until years later, and he fully believed me knowing the area. That area was just bad news, and I'm genuinely amazed that something bad didn't happen to me with how much I was let out alone. I really hope that I didn't witness what I think I did, but to be honest, I think it was what I saw. I live in what I believe is a house that's built between 1200 years ago to about 600 years ago. It's a cottage completely made from stone, apart from some newer installed pipes, and its original walls and structures were constructed by Viking settlers probably around 500 AD. All of our doors are made of heavy, thick wood, and I think our house is very likely to be haunted. The first few things that happened while we lived in our house were subtle, yet still noticeable. What I mean is that the house felt uneasy during the day, but it could be brushed off. But in the dark of night, it was almost oppressive. Now, one day I wasn't home for the night, so my mum was home alone. She told me that she was getting ready to go to sleep at about 12, and she apparently heard footsteps at the top of the stairs, and my bedroom door opening as well. She went to check it out because she thought that it was our dog who had went into our room or something, but the room was empty and absolutely freezing, and my mum told me that she felt really unsafe, which caused her to leave the room and shut the door immediately. When she went back downstairs to the living room, she saw that our dog was asleep on the couch. After this happened, about maybe 2 years ago, things have just sort of slowly begun to escalate further as well. Even in the middle of summer or when our central heating is on, my room always feels frigidly cold. Every night I would hear vague banging around the house, and very often things would be moved around or changed, for instance, and many times the vacuum cleaner head had been switched from carpet setting to hard floor setting, which neither me or my mum remember doing. But I was always blamed for doing this, and it caused a few arguments before as well. But this is when I started hearing, at night, whatever it was, slowly climbing the stairs towards my bedroom. It was always very slow, one step every 5 or 10 minutes, and always ended with a horrible feeling of dread all around the house, especially if it was very dark. I was trying to get to sleep once when this happened. My bed was right beside where my door opened from, and I watched as the doorknob twisted and the door swung open. I huddled under my covers for a bit, but when I came out for breath, I saw a flash of some face hovering over the edge of my bed. Its eyes were dead, and its skin was dry and rotten, and it had a warped smile as well. It disappeared as fast as it had appeared, and it left me almost paralyzed with fear until I must have just passed out or something, because all I remember next was waking up in the morning. Now, this sort of thing happens most nights, if I don't have a light on in my room, that is. There's always activity on in the stairs and in the attic, with my attic door being moved open several times in recent years, as well as sometimes groaning or growling in my house too. And the other night, a framed painting had fallen to the floor and then it was destroyed as though someone threw it to the ground and took an axe to it. Though it didn't disturb my dog even, and who would have gone crazy, well, logically speaking, I would say, but I myself went down and destroyed the painting in that manner as well. I also think that it even follows me around outside of my home now as well, which is terrifying. A few nights ago, I was moving some black bin bags out to the back of the workplace to put them in the dumpster, and there are no lights around there, so it's pitch black. When I was returning from that, I noticed a white face staring at me from behind scaffolding. It was sort of elongated, and it sent a horrible chill down my spine. I only got a single glimpse until I did a double take, but by then it had disappeared. Later, after I had clocked out of work, I took a photo of that place where I saw the face, and the next day I took another photo. The only difference in the two photos? Two circular lights like beady glowing eyes in the photo that I took in the dark, while in the day, the same lights were nowhere to be seen, as if whatever was there had moved away. I don't know what's going on, but I just have this feeling that something is after me. So, for about 3 months, I've been experiencing hacking from what I assume to be another tenant in my building. It began with hacking my Bluetooth speaker. I'd be listening to something while doing housework, and the next thing that I know, my device would be disconnected and the hacker would start playing very creepy and inappropriate music via my speaker. The main song that they would play is Effed with an Anchor by Ailstorm, a song that I had never heard until this. If you choose to listen to the song, you'll see why this immediately freaked me out. I would try everything that I could to turn it off, but they would put the volume at full and play it again and again. This happened on 2 separate occasions too. After this, I stopped using my Bluetooth speaker to prevent this from happening again, until they hacked into my PlayStation and began playing the same song, again on full volume, and continued to play after I tried to press pause or exit my music app. I then unplugged my PlayStation and haven't used it again. Finally, yesterday, I had asked Google a question via my Google Nest device, and straight after I heard a ding on the device, signaling someone else was controlling it, which is only possible if I grant access, also the case with all the devices that they've hacked so far. Straight after the ding, the hacker started playing creepy music again, different from the last time, but it was an old song with a very creepy undertone, and the only words that I remember are, "Times are getting hard, boy," and I straight away unplugged my device to stop the music, and have stopped using the device altogether. Now, the reason that this freaked me out more than the last few times is the fact that I was on the phone with a friend at the time, talking about some personal things I had going on. Therefore, I believe the hacker is probably able to hear me, and I'm unsure whether this is due to them being a direct neighbor of mine, or whether they've hacked my devices to listen to me or something. I'm completely stumped with what to do now, as I've contacted my landlord, and all they said was that they'd send out a warning email to all tenants, but I needed to contact my internet provider for further action. I should have mentioned this earlier too, but I live in student accommodation, and to make it cheaper, everyone uses the same Wi-Fi but have separate logins. So the reason that it's easy for them to hack into my devices is due to them using the same Wi-Fi. So I then contacted my internet provider, and they said that they can't do anything about it. I really don't know what to do anymore as well. I have now had to forfeit use of 3 separate devices to ensure that this stops happening, but they continue to find a way to hack me. I feel incredibly unsafe and uneasy in my apartment too. I feel like someone's watching me as well. I'm becoming paranoid that somebody's listening to me at all times, and I feel as if I'm just going crazy. I don't know if it's just me as well, but I could have sworn that someone was watching me the other day. So please, if you have any advice for me, then I would love to hear it. So this happened way back in 2017. I, a female and 16, was in 5th grade at the time. Me and my sister, who was female and 19, were sharing a room, and we were casually just talking. She was in middle school and I was in elementary. So keep in mind too that I live in a 2-story house. The rail that goes along the stairs is like a metal gate, so you're able to see to downstairs and all that. At night, you can't see anything when looking downstairs though. It's literally just pitch black, as all you can hear is movement. So that night, me and my sister were just hanging out when all of a sudden we hear a deep raspy voice that's coming from the dark, and it said my sister's name, and we completely froze. Then, a couple of seconds later, it said my sister's name again, but with more force in its voice, and that's when me and her slammed and locked the door quickly. My stomach turned so much, and I had such a horrible feeling that I was about to die. I always tell people that it sounded like a clown that lost its voice almost. It was so raspy and scary that it just didn't sound normal. The only people home were my aunt and cousin, but they were asleep, and my mum's boyfriend had just left to work on a car, so me and my sister were the only ones awake, so we knew someone was inside. It got so silent though all of a sudden, and then we could hear the footsteps coming up the stairs. We started to freak out, obviously, especially since we didn't have anything to protect ourselves with if something happened. I was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher though, while my sister was on the phone with my mum, and my mum made me hang up on the dispatcher for whatever reason. Anyway, my mum's boyfriend gets here, and there's not a single thing moved. Everything was locked, and to this day I truly believe that someone was with us that night. I think about it every day. I truly thought that I was about to die that night. I thought that somebody had broken in and we were about to be killed. But after this, I now believe that this house has a couple of spirits roaming around, but I haven't had anything else happen, so to be honest, I don't know what that was. I had a strange encounter with an older man when I was 15. I just moved to another city, and my mother took me and my brothers to the mall. She told me that she would pick us up at one of the entrances at a certain time, so at about 10 minutes before then I sat on a bench waiting with my brothers, phone in my hand waiting on her call. I'm the quiet sort of, like laid-back type, so I'm really in my own world and not paying attention to the people around me at the time. But even though I'm not directly paying attention to anyone, I still have a pretty good sense in telling when someone or something is out of place. So all of a sudden I see a tall white man in an old-fashioned dark trench coat standing on the side of me. He's just looking at me with a smirk on his face. I was a young black male from the hood and had never seen someone dressed like him. I looked around to see if anybody else thought that this was strange, but everybody was just minding their own business. He asked if I believed in Jesus Christ. I just looked at him. This was particularly weird because I grew up very religious, but had just started to question my faith. He said more stuff related to Jesus and religion, but I zoned him out. I was low-key sort of irritated and looked over to my brothers, but they seemed to not even notice the man standing in front of me talking. The man still had his weird smile on his face. I got uncomfortable, so I looked at my phone to see if I got a text from my mother yet, but hadn't. It felt like time stopped as we stared at each other for a few seconds. Then the man said, "Your mother's outside." I looked towards the entrance but didn't see a truck. I turned back around to him, and when I did, he was gone. Nowhere in sight. It's like he just straight up disappeared, even though there was really nowhere to go. My phone started ringing, and it was my mother telling me that she was indeed out front. I looked to the entrance again and see her just now pulling up. I asked my brothers, where did the man that I was talking to go, and they said that they never saw me talking to anybody, especially no one like I described. He reminded me of sort of like the men in black, how they dressed. And when I was young, I thought that maybe he was a time traveler or something, but nowadays, I have no idea what this experience meant and who that person was. This takes a lot of strength just to share this, because ever since it happened, I just try not to think about it. I think that I have a tendency to downplay my own traumas and experiences, and this in particular is something that I just haven't allowed myself to fully process. About 1.5 years ago, my mental health was at an all-time low, and I was binge drinking regularly in seedy bars by myself. I was 23 at the time, and I'm 5'5", 125 pounds, a woman who had no clue what her limits were with alcohol and was doing anything to feel something. An extremely dangerous combination, I know. I was deeply ashamed of my mental health issues and still struggle with telling anyone what I'm going through to this day, or even allowing emotions to register fully or come to the surface so that even I know what I'm feeling. And so at the time, this was something that I was struggling with. So I was out past 2 a.m. and had been hanging around a group of girls, but they had left early without me after a woman had come on to me and kissed me, and they realized that I was bisexual. It was outright homophobia, but they basically seemed creeped out all of a sudden, and a member of the group asked me if I could give them a moment to talk without me, and I respected that request and politely left the group and watched as they sort of ditched shortly after. I was already fairly wasted when some guys offered me to come and sit with them at their table and that they would buy me some drinks. I remember stumbling to their table and thanking them, and most of what happened after this is honestly a bit of a blur. I remember dancing and making jokes, but also being fairly disoriented. I have a switch in my brain that can turn on when I'm anxious or threatened, and it's as if suddenly all of my anxieties, alarm bells, and panicked thoughts just go quiet, and only one thing is in my head. I'm in a strange place with strange people, and I don't know what's going to happen. I should try and be very nice and just try and get along with them so that they don't get upset or hurt me. They kept handing me drinks, egging me on to drink more and more, and even when I started telling them that I felt a little bit sick, they just kept handing me more, and pretty soon everything was just absolutely spinning. My phone was nearly dead, and I turned it off at 2%, trying to keep myself from losing that last bit of battery left for when I desperately needed some way home. Even when it was on, my vision had been so blurry that I could barely use it. I had never felt this drunk before, and to be honest, I was getting pretty scared. I started to throw up a bit at that point. I was barely conscious. I can't really even remember the moment that I realized that I might throw up. On the moment, I just sort of was hunched over, feeling weak, and suddenly I just saw vomit hitting the pavement. The guys started saying that they were heading out, and I remember hearing words thrown around like, "Take care of her," and "Back at my place." I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment my head was just clear enough to ask what might happen if they did that. I somehow mustered the focus and motor skills to clearly say my full address and state that my roommates were home and would take care of me. They just sort of chuckled and didn't really take me seriously. I even remember one of them jeering about it like homegirl didn't even slur, making humor in an almost pitying way that I could still recite my address clearly despite how intoxicated I was. The thought now that they thought that it was funny to see someone begging to be brought home to safety is more than a little sickening, I know. No matter what I said, though, it wasn't a question of if I was going back to one of their places. It was an assertion. At this point, I was feeling so weak and helpless, and I couldn't even really stand up by myself. My head hurt, my body felt like jelly, everything was spinning, and I honestly wondered if I might just die that night. I was going in and out of consciousness, but the next thing that I knew, I was being shoved into a small car. It gets sort of hazy at this point, but I remember the car stopping several times so I could stick my head out of the car and puke and whatnot, and the guy pulling my hair out of my face. It stuck with me that he did it so quickly and instinctually that it was almost like he'd done it so many times before. I remember at one point openly and loudly sobbing that I was scared and I thought that I was going to die. They just kept hushing me though and telling me that I was fine. Everyone in the car was so casual, relaxed, and not at all concerned with this very, very drunk woman in the back vomiting her guts out every 5 miles and having a meltdown. The intoxicated person that they had singled out alone at a bar, fed drinks long past she felt comfortable with, and were now forcingly taking home because she wasn't strong enough to fight them off. But I do remember that they stopped at a Taco Bell and ordered a bunch of things, but I refused to order anything as I knew that I wouldn't be able to keep it down anyway. I was running through scenarios in my head. I knew that they had every intent to act against my will. This was not a benign misunderstanding by any means. I was not supposed to be here, and they knew it too. But I was surrounded by 4 men packed in their car, all definitely bigger and stronger than me, and I deeply feared what would happen if I made some attempt to put a stop to what was happening. On top of this, it was close to 4 a.m. and my phone was pretty much dead, and I was too drunk to even stand or walk. If not with them tonight, where would I go? Or what would I do? Lay on the street and puke my guts out until I choked and died, or some homeless person found me and did who knows what? I was messed up, I knew it, and I was in trouble. I had a phone charger, but nothing to plug it into as well. I considered the worst, but also the most obvious answer. I had to play nice the entire night and pray that nothing else would happen, charge the phone at their place, get an Uber in the morning and leave, as calmly as possible so that as not to raise any suspicion. I had to play along, and I genuinely just couldn't think of any other plan. I wondered if I was going to choke on my own vomit and die at any point, as I was still blacking out and throwing up at this point, and these strangers were clearly not going to take me to get medical help. I wondered if I would get assaulted tonight, and even with birth control, if I would suffer further consequences like pregnancy or an STI. I wondered if he'd try to keep me as a prisoner, hurt me, or even maybe kill me. Easily the most painful part was the realization that I felt truly so stupid, so pathetic, so worthless and miserable in this moment in my life that maybe I just didn't care anymore. It felt like I had no one and nothing anyway, even though it wasn't entirely true. In the moment, it really did seem that way. But then, as stupid as it sounds, I remembered my cat. I remember the moment that I first held her when she was weeks old, eyes closed, and I fed her a warm bottle of milk. I thought about her now and how she sometimes would sit by the door and cry for me when I left for work because she was so attached and hated being without me. And what would she do without me? Would she know why I never came home that night? I made the decision that I had to survive this night so that I could hold her again. I re-entered that mode of no feelings, no thoughts, no anxiety, no panic, nothing. Just be extremely calm, nice, even, and smile until I find myself sober and capable of getting out of this situation. At this point, I was still coming in and out of consciousness when I felt the car come to a stop. I couldn't really sit upright without triggering more vomiting, but I remember attempting to slightly raise my head just enough to see we were in front of some small rundown home, I think. The guy sitting next to me, the one that had insisted that I go home with him, had been holding my hair back while I puked and told me now that this is his place and we're going to go inside. I tried one more time to tell him that I should go back to my apartment and my roommates must be wondering where I am. Again, he didn't even seem to take me seriously though, kind of just chuckled and just said, "Come on, let's go," and I told him that I was too sick and weak to walk and wanted to just stay in the car instead, and I don't think that I could even walk the short distance to the door, to be honest. He said that he would carry me there, and I still said that I couldn't do it. Everything was blurry. My spatial sense and visions were that of a sailor in a tiny boat traveling through a massive storm, a shaking, whirling, rocking mess. I remember my muscles trembling and my empty stomach clenching. I felt the cold air as he opened the door on my side and sort of just grabbed me and pulled me out. I felt my feet stumble on the pavement and weakly try to balance myself, but my head still could raise upright, and I remember looking straight up and leaning against his chest to keep from crashing to the ground. At this point, I actually started saying, "No, I can't do this. I'm going to puke. I just can't do this," and sobbing because just walking those 10 or 15 feet felt as if I were on the most frightening roller coaster ever designed. He just kept hushing me though and telling me to quieten down. Things go blurry for a bit after this, and I remember bits and pieces. I remember having a Gatorade put to my lips and encouraging me to drink it. Then at some point I realized that I was laying flat on my back on his bed and the lights were off with just a little bit of light coming from under his bedroom door, and he was standing at the foot of it. I broke down hard at this point and started crying harder than I had at any point before. My body was like lead though. I couldn't move a muscle. I was physically trying to, and my body just wasn't responding, which said to me that this wasn't just alcohol. But this was it, I thought. I'd been hurt so many times before, slapped, knocked around, grabbed, hurt, you name it, but I always felt a sense of relief that I'd never been sexually assaulted. But this may be the night. It was probably going to happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. I wanted to scream in that moment, but I didn't know what I could say that wouldn't be some kind of accusation and could trigger rage, violence, and things unimaginable. I tried to think of ways to communicate my lack of consent and fear in this moment without accusing him of what it seemed he was about to do. All I could think of was to say, "Please don't hurt me," in a weak whisper, barely loud enough to be heard, over and over again as the tears poured down my cheeks. He hushed me again and told me to just go to sleep and then lay down next to me. An hour or so would go by of quiet, and then he'd wake up and start kissing me. I laid there, still frozen in fear as he did this, hazy but conscious, tolerating it, only knowing what harm I was risking by reacting too strongly and loudly in dissent if it displeased him. He touched me on my chest and my bra several times and crooned about how I was just his type. But when he tried to reach into my leggings, I just started to sob all over again and beg, "Please don't hurt me." And to my surprise, he would give up after a bit of this, but seemed frustrated. I realized that he was messed up enough to abduct a drunk girl against her will and to have her all alone in his bed, paralyzed and terrified for him to take advantage of. But that sobbing and pleading for mercy was some kind of a turn-off, I think. This would repeat itself several times in the night, and I barely slept, but I made it through to the morning clothed and untouched below the waist. When morning came, I was sober enough to sit up and talk coherently. I tried my hardest to be extremely calm and casual. He nudged me to wake me up, and I asked if he could drive me back to my place and drop me off. He said that he could, but wanted to meet up with his friends from the night before and grab some pho at a nearby restaurant. I just smiled and nodded and said again that I was ready to go home and my roommates must be worried. He drove me to the restaurant, and despite this and his gall to ignore my request again to be dropped off, I realized as I sat in a busy restaurant surrounded by people in broad daylight that I was alert, sober, and in a public place. I had a chance to break free. I continually pushed for him to drive me home because my phone was still dead and I didn't know who else would help at this point. All through this meal, I was so close to freedom that it was all I cared about. So I joked and smiled and played along, thinking at every second that passed that soon I would be home with my cat and my roommates and safe again. He asked for my number just as he began heading back to the car, and I said, "Oh, I don't know," but when he pushed, I gave it to him, thinking that I was so close to getting out of here and I wasn't going to mess that up now and tick him off or anything. When I made it to my apartment, I stumbled in, embraced my roommates, and started sobbing and apologizing. I said that I was a reckless idiot. I made a huge mistake. I'm lucky to be alive, and I'm sorry for being so stupid. I told them what happened and how ashamed I felt for putting myself in that position, but they comforted me and told me that I had just been kidnapped against my will and that none of this was my own doing, that there are sick people and it wasn't my fault. Before any of this happened, I had a long list of trauma, and I cannot truly say that this was the event that broke me, because I think that I was broken long before that night, but I know that it has only made everything worse. Many other things have also happened since to compound the issue, unfortunately. At one point I was hospitalized, and I'm grateful for it. Things started to get a lot better after that, but I can't say that I'm even close to being mended. I just recently began seeing a therapist again, and I've opened up about the person and all of this trauma has made me into, and I isolate myself constantly and have become somewhat agoraphobic, rarely leaving my apartment. But when I do go out, it is never alone anymore, and I never drink. I often use virtual reality social games to meet people these days and have social experiences, because it's really the only time that I truly feel safe. I like knowing that I can always take the headset off, log out, that's it. I do hope that one day I can again find myself open, talking to my loved ones about my emotions and able to spend time with others outside of my two roommates in real life, but I'm just not there yet. But all in all, I'm thankful that I got lucky that night, that nothing truly horrible really happened to me, and please, if you're going through something, reach out to other people and get the support that you need. Don't be like me and don't take the risks that I took, because you may not get as lucky as I was. November 13, 2011 is when my mum went crazy. My parents were married for 21 years. My mum has always had her demons, but for a long time she at least tried. Sometime in 2006 or 2007, after I went off to college, she went off her meds for depression for who knows the how manyth time. But this time was different. I didn't realize what mania looked like at that time. I was only 18 after all, but years later I realized that she had an adult onset of bipolar disorder. And man, it was unnerving to say the least. It was the last straw for my dad, and he left. The divorce was finalized in 2008. My mum was never the same too. I think the combination of borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder, both diagnosed, meant watching her go up and down on a haunting roller coaster of destruction, also meant watching the small part of her that was a mother fade away. My dad left her the house, the one that we had lived in all my life. It's a beautiful home too, cozy and on the corner. There's a big bay window and natural light, and it's always felt like home, until the divorce, that is. I hated being in that house after my dad left. Her behavior became more erratic and the lows became so much lower, and the house began to change too. It was dark and stale, and you just couldn't wait to leave. I've always chalked it up to my perception as a young adult, weathering a divorce and my mum's downward spiral, but now, I don't know. You see, it got worse and worse over time, and then I got a phone call on November 13, 2011. I was living in another city. The call was from my father telling me that a neighbor noticed that he hadn't seen my dog in the bay window for several days and decided to use the spare key my mother had given him. The dog was found dead in the bathroom, and my mother in bed, weak and frail. She had laid in the bed for so long that her leg muscles had atrophied. The dog, I've never really been able to get answers on, but my sister once let it slip that there was blood. The cleaners that my aunt hired to clean the house also found my cat 3 days into the job, crushed to death between the ottoman and the chair in the back room. She spent the next few years in a catatonic state, first in the mental hospital, and then she was transferred to a nursing home. In the meantime, I was the one to clean up the house. She was a shopaholic hoarder, to say the least, and mental illness had only amplified it too. The first time that I came back home, it felt dark and stale, but it was empty. It didn't have the panicked pressure that I had felt with my mother there. I sorted and cleaned, sorted more and cleaned more, and sorted and cleaned even more. The more I did this, the lighter and brighter it became, until it felt like home again, I guess. Not really, but kind of. There was always a bit of staleness there that I just couldn't get rid of, but I attributed, and perhaps still do, it to my subconscious awareness of what had happened there. One thing that I did notice about the house, though, was that the lightness could become dark in the blink of an eye, and everything was gradual, if that makes sense. Like, you never noticed things until you were consumed by the stale darkness that was there. It was sort of like a cloak coming over the place in one steady sweep. It was odd, but, I mean, how can you explain it apart from just psychological, right? I had a boyfriend too, and our relationship wasn't exactly healthy to begin with, but I will say that he noticed the same things that I did with the house. And there were 3 specific incidences within that house that I would like to share. So one day, it was me, him, and one of his friends sitting in the middle room when we heard the distinct sound of the front door opening. They went to go and check, and it was closed, with no sign of being opened. The thing about the door is that, as it was old like the rest of the house, the door had become difficult to open and close. In order to open it, you had to put your shoulder into it, in fact, but in order to close it, you had to thrust your body weight against it several times sometimes before it would shut. We heard it open, but the weirdest thing is that we never actually heard it shut. To us, this just seemed impossible. And I mean, 3 people heard the exact same thing, so it wasn't like we misheard it. The second incident was my ex and I were sitting in the middle room once again. We were in our office chairs at our desks, talking about something, when we distinctly heard several creaks overhead and a sudden smash directly, and I mean directly over my head in the attic. It was as if someone took several steps until they were overhead and had either a plate or something glass and threw it with great force. The sound was so incredibly clear, and my ex and I locked eyes with each other and we whispered, "There's someone in the attic." I was gone. I bolted out to the garage and backed my car out and parked in the driveway. My ex came out to meet me and convinced me to stay where I was in the car, as he called his best friend, the same one who heard the front door open and not open, and asked him to come with his gun so that they could search the attic. His best friend arrived in less than 2 minutes with his weapon. They both went inside the house and searched the place from top to bottom, as I sat in the driveway. The way that this home was set up was that it was on a corner lot, like I said. The side gate faced the street, and there was a bay window that wrapped around the house and sort of stretched almost to the front door. We still had the blinds pulled up. This meant that from my vantage point I could see inside half of the house, and if anyone exited through the only 2 exits in the home, the front door and the side gate, I could even see the back fence from where I was. I would have definitely seen them. I could even see the roof, in fact. It was not a large home by any means, too, and I would have been able to see anyone if they were making an escape. As I waited for the boys to return, I half expected to see a homeless man scramble out of the house at one point. I mean, it was really the only thing that could explain the sound of something being thrown right above my head. The boys completed the search of the home, but there was nothing, and nobody was to be found. I asked if they had checked the attic. Thoroughly, they said. I believed them too. But the thing about the attic of that house is that it wasn't sort of a true attic. The rafters were set up in such a way that a person could not really walk around freely up there. If they did, they would fall through the ceiling. There was a light switch up there too, and the boys had examined every square inch of the attic, and there was no sign of life to be found. And in fact, there wasn't even any glass. Nothing. Now, it would be easy to write that off as just a strange sound that the old house had made, if it wasn't for one thing my boyfriend was insistent on: the footsteps that he had heard leading up to the crash. He was adamant. He had heard the footsteps above him as they walked to the spot right above me. He had heard the wood slightly creak as if something had lifted its arm up to throw something with force. I wear hearing aids, so I miss out on a lot of those sorts of sounds, but I had heard the creaking before the smash, and I knew by then when my boyfriend was being sincere. I believe him even to this day as to hearing those footsteps. Now, the third thing that happened was we were in the house for 2 or 3 years. I split my time between there and down south for college. My boyfriend, he stayed behind in the house, and he would mention that there were times that he just knew that he wasn't alone, but no other specific incidences took place. But the house began to get darker, and our fights grew worse and more violent. Something happened to my mind, and it all happened gradually until it was just horrible. A point of no return, in fact. To this day, the depression that I felt there was like nothing I've ever experienced before, and it changed me. After one particularly savage fight, too, I went for a drive and came back. I was alone, he wasn't there. I entered through the back door, and I was greeted by a wall of darkness. It was stale, cold and dark in there, even though all the lights were on, and I could barely breathe. I snapped and I yelled at the darkness in the kitchen for no particular reason. "Get out, go away, I see you, go, I'm sick of you." And to my absolute horror, it actually retreated. I swear to you on my son that I visibly saw the darkness shift backwards. I screamed at it some more and it retreated some more, and there was light again. The house was light and beautiful again. Now, the weirdest thing is that after this, my memory just seems to stop there, in the kitchen screaming at the darkness, because the next thing that I remember is that I was waking up in my bed, fully clothed on top of the sheets. The house is dark again, the staleness is there again, but when I walk into the kitchen, it's light and bright. Oddly enough, that was the first time that I considered the possibility that there might actually be something more to that house, that there might be something otherworldly there, but what, I don't know. Not too long after the incident in the kitchen, too, I left the house and it was put up for sale. I have been through many tough and trying times since then, but I have never experienced the darkness, the sluggishness, the staleness, the pressure, the panic, the hopelessness, the bleakness and the agony of that home since then. My gut tells me that there's something there. My rationalism is willing to concede that it could all be subconsciously rooted in the pain associated with the home's history. I admit that, but I feel that there truly is or was something dark and dangerous within that home. And I only wonder if it was there when my mother moved in with my father, or if she created it with her downward spiral. I had a reoccurring dream while in that house too, where I would walk into the middle room and see something that resembled a cross between the creature from Alien and Predator, and it would lock eyes with me, and I would hear in my mind, "Window Sullivan," and the dream would end. There's no one in my family with the name Sullivan, and I'm unsure if it's connected. Probably not, but I never had that dream again after leaving that home, which is really weird. So, all in all, I've never been able to really explain what might be in there, and it didn't seem to fit typical ghost tales. I'm not sure why. I wonder if my mother created it. It's just something that's popped into my head every time that I think about that house. I'm open to any suggestions or thoughts, but I am 100% committed to the experiences that I had here, and I swear by them. So this event happened over the weekend while I was home from college for my mum's birthday. On Saturday night, I had a couple of beers with my girlfriend, who was spending the weekend at our house because my parents are super chill. At about 12:30 p.m., maybe a few minutes after my parents went to bed, I went out to the back porch to grab a couple more beers for myself and my girlfriend, who was waiting in the basement where we planned to watch Game of Thrones for a while before going to sleep. I opened the back door and stepped into the back porch, and immediately, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt like I was being watched from the tree line. My back porch overlooks the backyard, which leads directly into thick woods. I didn't think too much of it at first, to be honest, because I always feel a little bit spooked going outside at night, but as I opened the cooler, I heard it. In my mind, it was unmistakable. It was the agonizing screams of what sounded like my next-door neighbor and her teenage daughter. I won't say their names because, internet creeps and all that. But what's even more terrifying is that I swear that they were screaming a very specific thing. "Sam, help us, please. Sam, help." That's my name. Now, I was already intoxicated and on edge, but I turned around without the beers and locked the door behind me as I went back inside because that was just too much. Then I heard my mum's voice calling from upstairs, asking me if I heard it. I responded yes and asked if she knew what it was. She didn't have a clear answer, only speculation, but she knew for a fact that our neighbors were both inside their home. In other words, whoever that was, that sounded exactly like my neighbors who were screaming for help, that was not actually them. When my twin and I were growing up, we lived in a home on Cemetery Road, and believe it or not, we actually lived next to a cemetery as well. We had a stepmom who befriended our neighbor. This neighbor was into some spooky stuff. And one day after school, my twin and I walked into our room to this chick messing with a Ouija board. We started yelling at her, asking her why and what are you doing and why are you in here? She simply said, if you're religious, you should probably pray, then proceeded to tell us that she spoke with a spirit named Alex that lived in our home. She left and she didn't come back for 2 weeks. During those weeks, nothing happened too. We felt relieved about that, to be honest. I was one of those kids who couldn't watch a scary movie without it affecting me, so when I saw what she was doing, I got pretty spooked. I mean, I've seen all the scary movies of Ouija boards, and they mean bad news, right? Then she came back. She walked into our kitchen, and the pots and pans just flew out of the kitchen right at her. She then told my stepmom, and she said, I don't believe in any of this stuff, but, the landlord's mum died here, and her name was Alexandra. And it was at this point that things really started happening. But I wanted to share one particular experience that I had growing up in that house because this one never left me. So it's not just my twin and I that lived there. There were 6 of us, and on this particular day, our little sister was at our mum's and our stepbrothers were at their friend's house. That neighbor's house, she actually had a son. And then we had a 6-month brother that was home, and our dad was out on a business trip, I think. Anyways, it's just me, my twin, and our little baby brother. Our stepmom got up at 5:30 in the morning to go job searching, and it was my twin's turn to go upstairs to listen for our brother when he woke up. After our stepmom left at like 5:45, I started to feel, uneasy and scared. My stomach twisted, and I started to feel nauseous, in fact. I could feel like something was watching me, so I went upstairs to go sleep next to my sister, and I made sure that I shut the door behind me. Now, this is an old house, admittedly, and everything creaks, and when someone is walking through the house, you can hear it. It's very loud. But I started to feel scared again, so I tried to wake my sister up, but she was out cold. And then I started hearing stomping up the stairs, like someone is running or walking very fast. I'm crying at this point, trying to shake my sister awake, but she just won't wake up. Then I tell myself, it's just Bethany, she forgot her coat or something. The door of the bedroom starts to open, and when it opens fully, there's nobody there. At least, nobody that I could see. Then I heard stomping going towards our little brother, and I got up so quickly and ran straight over there, snatched him up, and then ran back to the bed. And the moment that I sat down on the bed, my sister woke up to me crying, and the stomping, it disappeared. A lot of things happened in that house, but that was definitely the scariest experience that I'd ever had there, and it still gives me the spooks when I think about it. Our stepmom to this day tells me that I just dreamt it, but I know for a fact that I was not dreaming and I was not asleep. I grew up in a town in Dallas-Fort Worth area, but moved away for college. I just wanted a more liberal setting, chalk it up as youthful idealism, I guess, but I moved to the northeast to go to a school, and I would come back every holiday and summer to my folks' place and catch up with friends, the whole college sort of summer thing. So my college was very uneventful for the most part. I wasn't much of a school spirit kind of guy, and I just wanted to get it over with so I could go back home, because after 3 years of school, The youthful idealism gave way to reality pretty quickly. But one summer night, we're at the local college bar and I meet up with a girl that I've known since like elementary school. We go out for drinks and she just kept talking about this one guy who would always hit on her at the bar. So me, a 6-foot guy built fairly well, would be on the lookout for creeps, and that's when I saw him. He was a white male, bald, not at all intimidating to look at, just like an average-looking guy, I guess. But he looked older than us. I chalked it up to the bald head. But the thing that did creep me out was his gaze. It was like he was looking at you, but through you. He made small talk with her, and she introduced me to him, and he pretty much just went on his way. She turns and looks at me and says, "That's the creep." I leave it alone and don't think too much of it, and I go on about my night. But then, 2 months later, that's when I get this call. The guy was no ordinary guy after all. He was arrested for murder, and the details of the murder were so horrific that it made me literally uneasy. It's been years since then, and I do wonder about that guy. I think about the girl who lost her life in such a tragic way and the soulless gaze of that man who did such a horrible thing. I have a family of my own now, and I couldn't imagine getting that call. It's something that I think about every time my wife or daughter leave the house now, and it always just makes me feel really uneasy. Last week I was pretty excited to go on a tour of an abandoned schoolhouse near my home. It was closed for like 12 years and it was a very gloomy place. But the tour promised a paranormal experience, and it wasn't really like that though, I guess. When I arrived there was a sort of Beetlejuice narrator that was guiding the whole thing. It was a very dirty and smelly place, and I hoped for the worst. But then when it started, all my illusion fell, and the whole tour was more theatrical, sort of an insight into kind of like exorcisms, I guess. And so instead of feeling disappointed, I was actually very grateful because I had a lot of fun during the whole play. The next day I was cooking some lunch for the family, and I decided to get some water from the fridge, and the water was at room temperature because my brother didn't fill the water jar on time. And when I let it sit on the table to get a cup, the jar just exploded, and I got like 3 pieces in me. I decided to clean it all up before someone noticed, but then I realized that it was very difficult that this happened because the jar was at room temperature, and like I said, it just seemed to sort of explode out of nowhere. This was only the start too, because every day something different happened. Like yesterday when all the plants that I took care of for years, they just withered out of nowhere. Or on the weekend when I started to hear the doorknobs of the rooms that were already opened sort of rattling around, or people walking on the second floor when nobody's around. My family is kind of concerned by the situation, but they're waiting for everything to just sort of settle down. I guess they just hope that it will sort itself out. I really don't know what's happening, but I sort of determined in my own mind that there must be something paranormal going on, something following me to my house from this location that I had gone to, and it's causing all of these unexpected events. And I guess my question for all of you guys is, does anyone know what any of this means, and should I be worried? So before I start, I just want to say that my father has never been a believer in ghosts, the afterlife, none of it. He lost faith in everything after my grandfather died of cancer. Now, I've played this in my head a million times, and my dad and I have discussed it more than anything else, I think. This happened roughly 6 months ago. My grandmother had just passed. My father and I, along with the rest of my father's side of the family, were out there to clean out the farm and divide up their belongings and whatnot. Most of the family, they took small things from the kitchen and their old bedrooms, simple things just to remember them by. So, small talk here and there with my aunts and uncles telling me stories about the things that they were taking. I had a closer relationship with my grandma, but never met my grandpa. Keep in mind that I never met him too. So my dad, along with his older brother and myself, went down to the basement to grab the older poker table that my grandpa had. My uncle went back upstairs to grab a toolbox to take off some stuff off the walls, I think, and it was just my dad and I alone. The basement isn't finished, it's all brick walls, and the only light's a Christmas one strung up for light due to the ceiling one broke a few years back. I'm wandering around and I found some shoes in a corner. Without even thinking too, I say, "Aren't these the shoes that Grandpa was buried in? How did they get here?" My dad came rushing over, looked at the shoes. We looked at each other. He called my uncle to come and look at the shoes too. We go by the steps to meet him, and the Christmas lights go out. The lights upstairs go out, and then the door to my grandparents' bedroom, which is right next to the basement door on the first floor, slams shut. I turn my phone flashlight on, trying not to lose my mind, run over to where the shoes were, and at that point, they were gone. We ran up the steps, out the front door, and into his truck, and we just sat there, not knowing what to say. We both know that those shoes were there, and something or someone is in that house. Neither of us believe that it's my grandpa. I felt like throwing up, and the whole way home my dad was complaining of a migraine. I was 3 years old when my grandpa died, and the only one who would know that those shoes Grandpa was buried in was my uncle, who did confirm to my father that what he saw were actually his shoes. So one day last year, I was hunting on a ground blind on the outskirts of a field, about 20 yards from a stream. On the other side of the creek was a massive uphill slope completely covered in trees. We call this area the Thicket, and this property is roughly 2 hours northeast of Atlanta, GA. This particular day wasn't very active by any means. Had been in the blind about maybe half an hour and hadn't seen a deer yet. I heard something walking slowly down the hill behind me though, about my 4 or 5 o'clock, and just stopped right about the time it gets to the creek. It sounds heavy as it walks, so I'm expecting to see a deer, as there aren't really any other good-sized animals in the area. There have been bears sighted on the small road the property lays on, but it's always a big local story, and I've been living here for like 30 plus years and never seen one. Anyway, it's quiet for a moment. Then all of a sudden I feel something hit the top of the blind, about the size of an acorn maybe. I'm under a small tree, so I don't think much of it, but after about 30 seconds, it happens again. The nature of these occurrences leads me to believe that something didn't fall on the blind. Something was thrown at it. Now is about the time that I start asking questions. I didn't have time to ask many though before it stepped into the creek, and I can hear water splashing around. As a confirmation as to just how big and heavy this thing is, it was splashing a lot, whatever it was. I finally work up the courage to stand up in the blind and look out the back window flap to see if I can see my assailant. But there's nothing there, and the noises suddenly stop. I sit back down, wondering what the heck is going on behind me, and starting to get a tad bit unnerved. But that's when I hear its grunting, and it makes these concerning vocalizations and once again starts stomping around in the creek. Now, when I hunt, I'm usually carrying a buck knife, a 9mm handgun, and my primary rifle is a Browning X-Bolt, chambered in .300 short magnum. For anyone who doesn't understand what that means, the too long didn't read version is that it's a massive, unreasonable, powerful bullet. Most deer that I kill with it never run away and bleed out somewhere. They're usually dead before they even hit the ground from blunt force trauma. In short, it's a hair short of being considered overkill. The reason why I tell you this is to highlight the fact that I wasn't exactly defenseless at the time, quite the opposite. After about 2 or 3 more minutes of hearing this thing causing a ruckus in the creek, I decided that my only way out of this was a confrontation. So I stand up, unzip my blind, and take the safety off of my shoulder cannon as I step out into the open field. But again, it's just not there. Nothing in the creek. Nothing in the field. Nothing in the thicket. No sounds of any kind. Nothing. I've had about all that I can stand at this point, so I don't care how many guns I have. Nothing that big and that heavy can just vanish into thin air like that. It was time to get back to the RTV and get the heck out of there, and now. But I couldn't even take one step in the direction of my ride when I hear it again, walking slowly back up the hill, deep into the thicket. And I swear this time, I think that I can hear it breathing too. I looked up in that direction, but I couldn't see anything. Needless to say, I haven't hunted in that field again, and to be honest, I don't plan to either. I currently live in the middle of a duplex-style 6-unit apartment complex. We've lived here for close to a year now. Since moving in, there have been a number of renovations and improvements on the property. The previous owners of the establishment were of Japanese origin, and the family had several graves on the property too. They owned the land for decades and were actually forced to sell due to the economy. On both sides of our unit, our immediate neighbors are a Catholic old woman, and on the other side is a family recently immigrated from Mexico. Not to mention too that the land that I live on is in western Pennsylvania, and there are several Native American burial grounds surrounding me as well. I give this context to explain where some of my recent research has factored in. So, after moving in, me and my wife have experienced doorknobs leading outside the house wiggling late at night, and just an overwhelming sense of dread when on the property outdoors at night. There have been some headaches and nightmares following this as well. We had some doors locked on their own, and including the bathroom one, which luckily has one of these sort of coin unlock safety features on the outside. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but we could still get in. But we've also heard strange deep groans coming from the large field outside, which we originally chalked up to deer mating in our area. All of this was pretty easy to pass off, as we're semi-skeptical and don't really often jump to paranormal conclusions, I guess you could say. That was until our roommate moved in. Since then, both me and him, both of us being men, have experienced a growling entity, is all I can say, in the lower level of the building. We both have described the sound almost perfectly despite being alone when hearing it. The doorknobs have been rattling more frequently and violently, even on days with no wind, which has started to debunk my previous conclusion. The growling that we hear is sort of a mix between maybe a dog and a painful groan. It's happened several times all around 3 a.m, and we also both have a habit of waking up around that time with no explanation or outside noise interference. I personally have experienced an overwhelming amount of dreams that involve being followed, chased, watched, or otherwise tormented by strange humanoid creatures. All of these began within the past few months too. Now, while the probability that this spirit is that of a previous tenant or perhaps a Native American possibly buried somewhere near the property, I personally believe that this is of Japanese origin, possibly a member of the family that used to own the property. I get the feeling of abandonment and anger due to the changes made to our residence. I've tried to do the usual salts and sage, prayers and protection rituals, but honestly, nothing has reduced the activity. I am willing to coexist with whatever this is, but with the locked doors and objects being moved, it's starting to feel as if whoever this is or whatever it is does not entertain the idea of our presence. If anyone has any idea of what this might be or why conventional methods are just not working, then feel free to leave it in the comments, because I'm interested to see if there's something that I might be missing. So my grandparents had a holiday vacation home on the Isle of Wight in the UK. The house itself was a grand Victorian mansion that had been turned into apartments. My grandparents had the ground floor apartment that included the garden with a sea view from the cliff tops, and it was really beautiful. Now, I have a large family, and we all stayed there regularly, together or with our separate families, and over the years, family members had seen things like apparitions in the hall, an apparition of a Victorian lady walking across the garden. A few people had witnessed the wardrobe fly open in the middle of the night, but I, personally, had not seen or heard a thing over 20 years. My grandparents were getting older, and they wanted to sell their holiday home. For the last night that I stayed there with my family, my parents were in one bedroom and my brother and sister were with me in another. There are 2 beds, a wardrobe in the room, along with an ensuite shower. During the night, my younger brother, 12, got up and started sleepwalking. The first and only time, he's now 31. He stood in the ensuite and kept repeating that he had to go to work. My brother hated that ensuite from a baby, and it was dark, creepy, and had no windows. He would never use it. So I guided him back to his camp bed and we both went back to sleep. Later in the night, I woke up because I heard a loud banging sound. I looked around and I saw my brother and sister sleeping. The banging continued. I looked behind me where the sound was coming from and saw the headboard was moving back and forth from the wall. I then realized that my bed was in fact shaking. The room suddenly became blacker than black. Hard to explain, but I was so petrified, I think, that I must have just passed out because I really don't remember trying to get back to sleep or anything. I just remember waking up in the morning. When I got up, though, I told my siblings at the breakfast table. My brother said that happened to me, and he said years before the same thing had happened to him, but he kept screaming for Mum and Dad. He said the room got darker too, and he had never told anyone the story, because obviously he thought that no one would believe him. He's an adult now and still doesn't believe that it was paranormal and that it was probably just his imagination. But I personally just really can't explain what happened that night. I mentioned about my brother sleepwalking as it was so out of character for him, and it just felt like part of all the weirdness that night. I don't think that it was sleep paralysis, as I distinctly remember moving around in the bed, but I would love to hear your thoughts. Malevolent, or perhaps playful? I normally lose people when I get to the bed shaking bit. I know it sounds far-fetched, but it really did happen, and I still have no explanation for it. I'm a petite woman, and at the time of this situation, I was around 26. I lived in an apartment that was built into a hill. The front of the building was ground floor. You walked through a door and down a flight of stairs, and my and another apartment were on the ground floor back there. The stairs led to the walkway with the 2 doors facing each other, and we also had another door behind the apartment, but you would only know about that door if you sort of lived back there. It was a row building with 2 other apartments connected, so 4 apartments total. You would also only know that back door if you worked maintenance or knew somebody who lived there, I guess. We each had a little patio, though, and a locking door, and at the time that we lived there, we literally never used that door, and even had stuff up against it. So, after I got my daughter to sleep in her room, I was sitting in the living room alone. My roommate, or ex, was out, watching TV and messing around on my laptop, when I hear a knocking, and at first I thought it was coming from the window next to me, but it was actually coming from that back door. I sort of yelled quietly to hold on, moved the stuff from in front of the door and open it enough to see and turn on the light. And standing there was this man that I'd never seen before. I had only cracked the door open because I'm 5'2", 110 pounds, a woman, and it's nighttime, around 11 p.m, and there was enough stuff behind the door that it was hard to fully open even if I wanted to. So I looked the guy over and I ask, "Can I help you?" He looks me over and asks if some person that I've never heard of was home. I told him that I didn't know anybody by that name and had lived here for years, so no idea where said person might be, but it definitely wasn't here. He apologized, and I tell him that it's fine, and then I shut the door. I was a little on edge, I admit, because, why the heck did this dude come to the back door instead of the well-lit front door, right? So I sit back down trying to convince myself that this was just an innocent encounter when he knocks again. This time, though, I'm a bit scared and angry. If he wakes up my daughter with his knocking because I don't answer, it will take me literally hours to get her back to sleep. So I crack the door and angrily tell him to go away. He's standing there with his shorts around his ankles, just cranking away. I screamed and slammed the door, running to the kitchen to get a butcher's knife and called the cops. I sat in the door of my daughter's room holding the knife with all the lights off on the phone to 911 whispering to the operator so I don't wake up my daughter. I don't know how my scream of the disgust and the fear didn't wake her up, to be honest, but at that point I'm too scared to be grateful. But since she had two big windows that the jerk had to pass to get to my door, I'm not taking any chances that that pervert might try to look in or even get to my daughter. Eventually, though, the cops show up, take my statement in my living room. The second cop was looking around for the guy, and this jerk tells me that I shouldn't have opened the door at all. The first time, that is, and especially not the second time. He told me that I should be more careful and they'll look, but he doubts that they'll find this guy. He basically shamed me for opening my own door, and I went from shaking in fear and shame to straight up angry. I told him that I didn't do anything wrong. This is where I live, and my sleeping daughter didn't need to be woken up by some jerk insistently knocking at my door. He got defensive at this, and I told him to leave. After that, though, I double-checked all the doors and the windows and stayed up with my knife until my roommate got home around 4 a.m. I had called him and told him everything after the cop left, but he was far away and it took him a while to get back. He told me to go to bed after he got back, and I just couldn't. So I made myself a bed of blankets and stuffed animals next to my daughter's bed and was able to get a few hours of restless sleep before she woke up on in the morning. I still don't know how that guy knew about the back doors or if he even actually knew somebody who used to live there. After the situation, it's hard to believe that he didn't know that I was there alone. I never saw him again, though, and we never had another visit to the back door. But after explaining what happened to the front office of our apartment, they provided all of us with little fenced-in yards and also a chain lock for the back doors. We already had them on the front doors. I was on edge for about a week afterwards, but decided to keep a knife next to my bed to grab if somebody ever tried something like that again. I also got blackout curtains and mirror film for the living room so nobody could ever see in. I already had blackout curtains on the bedroom windows, but my cats like to look through the living room window and their cat hut was up against it, so the mirror film covered when they would pull back the curtain. Still to this day, I keep an X-Acto knife right next to my bed to grab in case of an emergency like this. And all I can say is, ladies, be careful. Don't open your door enough for a person, or a man especially, to put his foot through. And if you don't have enough light to see who's at the door, don't open it at all like I did. That guy easily could have pushed his way into my apartment the second time that I opened the door, and I admit that it wasn't the best idea. And the idea of that still haunts me too. My daughter was only 6 or 7 at the time, and if he got in and took me out, it doesn't bear thinking about what could have happened to her. About 7 years ago, before I met my now husband, I joined a few dating apps. A few of my friends had wonderful experiences and even met their now spouses on there, so I figured that I'd give it a try. I was 21 at the time and had also recently lost quite a bit of weight and was tiny for the first time in my life, so I was ready to put myself out there. I didn't take it too seriously, let the men come to me sort of thing, and eventually there was a guy who caught my eye. His name was Watson. He was 23 and very handsome in my opinion. We matched on Bumble and kept talking for quite a while. It turned into texting, then phone calls, and then him asking to meet up. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think that I have any superpowers or can tell the future, but when he asked to start seeing each other in person, I just had an off feeling in my gut. I thought maybe it was just anxiety, but later I found out that somehow I just knew. After blowing off plans and saying that I was busy multiple times, he got mad and blocked me on everything. That was fine. I felt a bit bad, to be honest, but I was also 21 and he gave me the creeps, so good riddance, really. Fast forward 6 months later, and I had met and started dating my now husband. It was around this time that I got a message from Watson on Facebook and let him know that I had met someone new and I wished him well. But he got really angry, oddly too, for someone that I had never met in person. He started calling me names, swearing a ton, so I blocked him. This was the last place that I hadn't blocked him on. Then came the spam accounts, the new Instagram handles, more name calling, which eventually actually became threats. Thankfully, he did back off and stop eventually. I was really relieved too, because I hadn't dealt with someone like this before or even after, so I was genuinely scared. But a year later, I was at Target shopping for some new shoes and makeup. I checked out, headed to my car, keys in hand. I had just opened my door after loading my trunk when I swear that I heard someone yelling my name. So I turned around thinking that it was a friend or a coworker, but no, it was Watson. I got into my car without a word. I definitely went into fight or flight mode and I was ready to fly. The last thing that I saw of him, though, was him standing in the middle of the Target parking lot after chasing my car. It's been years and I haven't heard or seen him again, and I hope to never have any other creepy encounters like that. But a point of advice for any of you guys out there looking for a girl on a dating app, trust me, don't chase girls. We hate that. I used to work the docks of a salmon cannery in middle of nowhere, Alaska, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, no days off from May until August. It was a really cool job, if I'm being honest, but lots of seedy characters. Seasonal work in remote places seems to attract people who don't really fit in with normal society, I guess. Or people who, well, want to get away from something, maybe. Gary, he was one of those people. He had worked at another place in town that was owned by the same parent company, and in the lead up to the fishing season, he was lent to us for some carpentry tasks. Gary was probably in his 40s or 50s, grey hair, weird delivery in his speech. Not like a speech disorder, just like weird, I guess, is the best way to explain it. Like he was smiling inside about something grotesque while he spoke. When he first got to our camp, he was telling me the HR staff kept asking him all these personal questions. I asked what kind of questions, and he responded that they wanted his full name and phone number. He told them that he didn't feel comfortable with that and would be willing to work for a reduced rate if he could just keep the information to himself. Obviously, that was a huge red flag. One day, though, I'm working with a coworker on a little welding project when Gary pops out of a doorway. He goes, "Hey, you guys want some meat?" We've been eating cafeteria food for weeks at this point and working hard enough that we always maintain a caloric deficit. You don't say no to good food, right? He cut us each off a slice, and it was a smoked something. Now, here's some personal info on me. My family is Eastern European. I was born in New York City and then spent half of my childhood in NC. I've been eating smoked meats of every variety all my life, pretty much. It's a piece of my culture, basically. But I don't know what the heck this was. It was almost pork, I guess, but it wasn't pork. Gary goes, "You guys like that?" To which we respond sheepishly, "Yeah, thanks, Gary." Gary literally laughs at this, like slowly and creepily, and then just leaves. Now, me and this guy that I'm working with look at each other and sort of laugh it off and say, "Well, we must have just eaten Gary's wife or something." Dark vibes. I love my job. Anyway, later that night, I'm in the cafeteria alone eating a bagel. Gary walks in. "Hey man, you liked the meat earlier?" "Yeah, Gary, it was good," I respond. Gary goes, "That's funny, man," and then just sort of laughs softly. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that I ate a slice of Gary's wife that day. I haven't told this story much, and it still creeps me out to this day. See, when I was 12 years old in about 2013, I moved to this old house built in about the 1940s. No one has lived in this house for over 30 years, and it was the first fall that I'd seen at this house. I was taking trash out to our back porch, and from there I could see a tree line that's normally very green and hard to see through. But seeing how it's fall, the leaves are almost all fallen. And as I walk out to take the trash out, I look at the tree line. About 30 to 40 yards away, I see 4 or 5 of at least 7 foot tall, like pure white humanoid and no-faced creatures. I stand there in awe, not knowing what to think. It honestly looks like they're sort of talking with hand gestures or something, but I couldn't hear anything, obviously. Now that I think of it too, I really heard nothing at the time. No birds, bugs, or even the trees moving with the visibly moving branches. I screamed, "Hey," to which the creatures became sort of motionless like a statue. Then I proceeded to ask, "Who are you?" To which I stand there for a second before the creatures dispersed. Now I could see far into the woods, and they all went their separate way, not even hearing a leaf or a twig crack when they fled. But they ran off so quickly that it almost seemed like a blur as well. To be honest, after that, I sort of completely forgot about the experience until later that night, which I know is really weird. As I said though, I was young, and at this time my mum worked night shift and wasn't there for when I screamed at these creatures. For your interest too, I lived on essentially farmland, but my neighbours could easily walk up my driveway in a matter of like 2 or 3 minutes. So, later that night, around 9 p.m, I heard knocking on my back door, the one where it leads to the back porch where the creatures were, and I thought that maybe my mum told the neighbours to check up on me or something, so I go to check it out. I go to the back door, turn the back porch light on, and open it to where nobody was there. Casually, I sort of chopped it up to maybe one of my dogs hitting the door or something around like that. Now, after this, knocking kept coming from the door, and it was weird because every time that I rounded a door to where I could see the back door, the knocking just stopped. This happened a few more times every few minutes as well, ranging from when I turn my back from the door to when the moment that I sit back on my bed to just waiting 5 or 10 minutes before it happened again. After about an hour of this, I think, and increasing anxiety, I got fed up and I went outside to scream, "I don't know who you are, but you better stop." And to my surprise, it did. For about 30 minutes, that is. Then the knocking came around the house, on the windows, the doors, the walls from the outside for about another 30 minutes. I was scared, curled up in the corner of my bed. After the 30 minutes, there was one last bang beside my window that I felt like sort of shook the house a bit, and was shocked the window didn't break, in fact. And that was the end of it. There was really nothing for the rest of the 5 years that I lived there. The shocking part, though, was that the outside was old, as stated, and could honestly be broken with one good swing to the exterior, but where that final bang was, there was no sign of any impact. Honestly, I think that's what scared me the most, too, that this creature could full force shock my house and leave, like, no damage whatsoever. I lived in Tennessee, by the way, if this maybe helps figure out what this thing is. Side note, too, is that I have some friend stories with these creatures if anyone wants to know about them, but for now, this will have to do. Me and my roommate moved into this place about 10 months ago. The landlord who lives above us told us that this place is haunted. Our landlord is 80 years old and apparently channels. She says that she channels her higher self as well as living people who passed on and ashed her or something. And I'm like, okay, that's cool, sure. When we looked at the house, we saw the sauna. It has like an old wooden door, but after we moved in, handprints appeared on the door, and they looked like they were sort of dragging down, I guess. I mean, that could have been anything, right? But fast forward a little bit, and I'm in the bathroom. My roommate downstairs is in his room. I hear footsteps coming up the stairs, and I wait to see if he pops up, and no. I call him over Facebook and ask, "Are you upstairs?" But I can hear him downstairs in the room. He says, "No, I'm in bed. Why?" I explain that I heard footsteps. I go down to his room. Later, he needs to use the bathroom. And the same thing happens to him. He hears footsteps and nobody's there. We stayed in the same room that night, and the next thing that happened was just super creepy. You see, me and my roommate were sitting in his bedroom watching some videos and drawing. He has this old music snow globe that he has on his dresser. The video that we had playing was a gameplay video, and it had music box music for the background sound. We thought the sound was a little bit odd, so we paused it, put the video back 10 seconds, and played it again. We then realized that it was the snow globe that was actually playing. We could hardly believe it. A while later, and we were in bed, and in the middle of the night, we both heard a bang. We didn't see what it was, because, we just got out of there, but when we got up the next day, his Silver the Hedgehog pop figure was on the ground, with his limbs, and all 4 of them, ripped off. And there's just no way that should have been possible. There was a hand on the sofa, 2 feet off the ground, a leg under a blanket, and 2 just on the floor. The GameCube that we have was also opened, and the creepy thing was that the little clear stand pop figures that we have, all of them were unmoved, untouched, except for that pop figure. It was a really weird experience, and for us, we just could never explain it. A month later, I used this filter on TikTok. It's supposed to catch ghosts or whatever. It has sort of like glowing eyes and would appear when it finds a face. And I always felt like something was watching me, and so I started to film. I walked up the stairs to the main floor, and something popped up at face level, looking like it was peeking around the corner. I got a bit freaked out by that, I admit, so I ran to my room. A week ago, our landlord was out for a family thing, and we heard someone running up and down the hall at like 11 p.m. at night. We heard banging and thumping, and it sounded like somebody was dropping something. Our landlord is not the strongest and can't run or carry things, so we found this out later that she definitely wasn't home, and even if she was, there's just no way that she could have done this. Again, a few days ago, I was downstairs trying to find some towels, and my roommate is upstairs. He said, Rose, are you up there?" I replied with, "No, why?" And not even a minute later, I hear something loudly whisper in my ear, a pookie or something like that, which is just a weird thing me and my roommate say to each other. I jumped out of my skin and looked to the door wondering if my roommate snuck up on me or something, but he was upstairs, still in the bathroom. 2 days ago, I cleaned the bedroom, and all was good. Like, I was proud of that room. And yesterday, we found a dead spider on the dresser. Today, all the legs were ripped off and placed all around it. We just constantly feel like we're being watched, and we always hear footsteps, like I said. Have you ever felt something like this? Like someone is giving you a death glare that you can almost imagine them being there? You can sort of feel it, I guess. But when you look around, there's nobody there. That's how I feel a lot in this place. When we come home from work, we can sort of feel it, as if something's looking at us through a window or something. We're moving soon, and it's starting to get worse as well. We mentioned moving before the whisper in my ear, and I don't know if it wants us to stay or go, but in any case, we're getting out of here as quickly as we can. A few years ago, in the northern parts of Sweden, I'm going out for a nice evening of fishing. I am what I guess is a fisherman supervisor. I checked that the other fishermen get their license at a certain area of the lakes and streams and whatnot. And anyway, this is in late summer, and I've been doing my round, which I usually end with going to a small lake and fly fishing for some trout. This lake or pond is pretty deep in the forest, and I rarely meet anyone there. Actually, I've never really met someone there, I guess. This lake looks kind of like a crater, I guess you could say. A perfect round circle that's perhaps 100 meters in diameter. It contains a natural population of perch and trout. Anyway, it's a warm summer evening with a slight breeze. The birds are chirping and the fish is rising to all the insects spawning on the surface. I rig my gear and aim for one of the fish rising to the right of me. At the same second as my fly lands on the surface, it's like someone pauses time or something. The sun hides behind a cloud, the wind stops blowing, the birds are suddenly completely silent, and the fish stop eating too. All of a sudden, a smell rises from the ground that I'm standing on. It smells like something dead, something really rotten, like I have a carcass buried under my feet. All of a sudden, I'm aware that there's also something walking out of the forest behind me, maybe 10 to 15 meters behind me. It's like I can see it in the corner of my eye, but I still really can't see it. I know it's really hard to understand, but every hair in my body is on end, and it's suddenly very cold around me too. This thing watching me just stands there, and I don't have the courage to turn around at all. I see my fly sink to the bottom, but I can't move. I can't do anything about it because I don't dare move. Then the wind just hits me, and it carries the awful smell away. The sun hits me again, a bird is singing somewhere in the forest, and the almost overtaking feeling of being watched lets go of me. I turn around suddenly, and there's nothing there. On the lake, the fish start rising again, and at that, I pack my gear and I throw the backpack on my back, and I run for it. Through the forest, all the way to my car. I hit the gas and drive like a maniac until I find the big road and civilization again. I park at the side of the road and say to myself, what the heck was that? My heart is still racing. I haven't visited this lake since this happened, and I know I won't be. What do you guys think it was, though? I've probably visited this place 20 times before this happened and never felt anything like it. The only thing is that I'm always afraid of bears when I visit it. I do fish at a lot of ponds and lakes that are pretty deep in the forest, but nothing like this has ever happened. There's a lot of wildlife in these places, of course. Deers, moose, fox, and the occasional wolf, bobcat, and bear. I'm familiar with them, and this just wasn't that. I'm never afraid of meeting one except when I've been visiting this particular lake, and anyway, I apologize for my bad English. Like I said, I'm from Sweden and it's not my first language, but I hope you get the gist of it, and if you have any ideas of what this could have been, then I would really love to hear it. Thanks. So I like to look for new, out-of-the-way fishing holes. If I'm on a trip and have my gear, I'll pull up a map, look at the different connecting waterways, and try to find back roads that may lead to spots that few people know about. On one trip, maybe about 10 years ago, I'm in Western PA and I'm looking for a road to connect me with this small and sort of out-of-the-way stream that I found on the map. I'm in the country. It's not too desolate, but houses are definitely getting farther and farther apart and looking more and more, well, beat up, I guess. I surmise that I'm really close to where this stream is supposed to be, so I turn down a dirt road that leads toward a tree line in the direction that I believe this stream could be. The road starts out in okay shape, but as soon as I pass into the tree line, stuff gets really weird. It's mid-afternoon, but the canopy of trees is so thick that it suddenly looks like dusk. Then the road very quickly deteriorates, starts to close in, and then starts to pretty much vanish, I guess. There are banks on either side of me, so I figure that I'm on some sort of old logging road that rarely if ever gets vehicles on it anymore. The road is getting worse and worse. Large rocks start appearing at random spots in the road, at first sort of sporadically and then more frequently. It's very unnatural looking. It looks like they were placed on purpose, I guess, but my car has a four-wheel drive. I'm getting a little worried because the rocks are getting larger, and combine this with how tight the road now is and driving around them is becoming more and more sketchy. It's definitely becoming harder to get through this. I'm now driving very slow so as not to pop a tire or make a wrong move and get stuck on the bank or something. But the road suddenly takes a very sharp left-hand turn and sort of downward as well. I creep along this turn but stop as I see the road continuing this weird downward trajectory. At this moment, my gut starts talking to me and telling me to turn around, but it's at this point that I realize that I can't. The road is just not wide enough to do a three-point turn. I could chance it, but I didn't want to get my front end caught on something pushing over the bank or my back end going off the back in the other direction and getting stuck. So I say to myself, keep pushing forward and you are bound to get to just enough room to turn around shortly. As I make my way driving this weird downward road with sharp curves and oddly placed rocks, I start to see items off to the side of the road. At first, it's just garbage, bottles, boxes, wrappers, etc. Then I start seeing toys, kids' toys, and lots of them, like an uncomfortable amount. Then I start seeing clothes. Some look old and weathered like they'd been there for years, and some look fairly new. The amount of clothes that I'm seeing also increases. Then I start seeing mattresses. Not one mattress, but lots of them, all over the place. They're dirty and there's heaps of dark stains on them. And it's at this point that my gut is now screaming at me to get out of here, but I still don't have room to turn around. While I'm sitting there and trying to figure out my next move, I suddenly get the distinct feeling that I'm being watched from somewhere. The moment that feeling hits me, I audibly yell at myself, "Nope." Then I slam the car in reverse and drive reverse, dodging all of the random rocks and all the way back up and out the sharp turns until the path levels out again. I go full on get the heck out of here mode and risk making the three-point turn as well. My back end goes slightly off the bank and I slam back into drive and pound the gas to throw myself back onto the road and out of whatever dark woods horror movie that I just discovered. I still have no clue what I happened to come across that day. Best case scenario was probably some deep woods meth den. All I know is that ever since then, no matter what I'm doing, the moment that my gut starts telling me to get out, I listen to it. When I was 12, I lived in a town called Stormy. I lived in a house with my mum and my older brother at the time, who wasn't home for most of this, but one night I was up late, probably around 4 in the morning, when I suddenly heard what sounded like somebody standing next to me and just sort of breathing. Almost spot on the sound that you'd hear if somebody inhaled through their nose and then exhaled from their mouth. I got up to try and pinpoint where it was coming from, and every time I thought that I was coming closer to it, it would move and suddenly it would be behind me or in another corner of the kitchen or something. Once I realized that, I went straight up to my room until sunrise, which was just above the kitchen. When the sun came up, I went down and my mum was awake and went to her and told her I wanted to tell her about something, and she said that she wanted to tell me about something too. So I went first and told her what I had heard, and her response was that she was about to tell me the same thing, that she had been getting up early some mornings and sitting in the kitchen on the computer and hearing this breathing sound. After that, this thing came around for a good 2 weeks or so, every night, in the middle of the night. Until one time I finally broke down and screamed at it to leave us alone, and it just immediately stopped and never returned after that. Another time I was laying in my bed on my phone and talking to my friend in another town when my mattress just started shaking violently. It wasn't an earthquake or anything like that, because it was only the mattress that shook. It felt exactly like as if someone had walked up to it, grabbed it, and just started shaking it like crazy. Whenever family members would visit this house, they would always think that they saw someone going up the stairs. One night, I slept in our living room by myself with nothing on and distinctly heard someone whisper my name to me. A lot of other things have happened while living there too, including weird stuff outside. I'm in my 30s now, and I've never been able to come up with a satisfying explanation as to what could have been making that breathing sound, or how it could also be able to move around like that and reacted to me yelling at it. I guess why I'm sharing this too is that I'm wondering, has anyone else had an experience like this? This story takes place 5 years ago. At the time I was 14 and I was a Boy Scout since I was about 11. It was on a summer holiday and we were usually 2 weeks in the wild just doing scout stuff. We get to know other scout groups from the other parts of the country too. It's generally a really good time to meet new people. This time, we met with 3 other groups and we would spend 3 weeks together. For the record, I was with the 2 other guys of my group and we shared a tent together. So, the days go on and one of my friends has a crush on this girl. But one day he invites her to our tent on the evening to have some fun playing cards and tell jokes, and she agreed. And on that evening, she snuck up to our tent and came with a few friends of hers. Her name was Mia. We had a good time during the night, and a couple of hours later, they both left. During the time at the camp, a good friend of mine, Lisa, had a crush on Mia who was also into her. And it was a really happy moment for everyone, really. The days go on, and Mia gets a little bit weird, I guess, and talks alone to people who aren't in the camp. As time goes on, rumors start spreading that Mia apparently tried to end her life in a forest or something. Apparently a kid saw her trying to do something, and after that they alerted the adults and she was going to get picked up by her parents a couple of days later. She was gone for a couple of days and everything pretty much went back to normal. Little did we know, though, that Mia was back in the camp, as other younglings saw her in the forest saying things in the likes of, "I want to see Lisa," while holding a knife. At that moment, everybody was scared. The adults decided to dress up a big tent and put us all inside, whilst we waited for Mia to show up. Eventually, she did show up too, saw us, and ran straight towards us with knife in hand. It happened so quickly, but I remember it. One of the adults managed to tackle her down and made sure that she wouldn't get up by holding her tight. Another adult made sure to pick her knife up and called for the police and her parents. When the police showed up, they took Mia, followed by her parents, and it was the last time that I saw her. Since then, I only ever really heard from her once more. I heard that she was diagnosed with schizophrenia or something like that, and she's in a clinic with people there to help her. Lisa is obviously still traumatized by all of these events, but one thing that really bums her out is that her name is one letter apart from Mia's. People sometimes mispronounce it, and it always makes her recall these events. Anyway, obviously Mia and Lisa aren't the real names of the girls, but you get the drift. It was a stressful time for everyone, and it's something that I'll never forget. So I live in an apartment with my family in Morocco, and I'm in a period where I need to focus for my final exams. Today, as usual, I'm sick, and so I didn't go to school. I use this free time to practice more for the upcoming tests, and at approximately, I would guess 8 p.m, my father called me and suggested that I should go for a car ride in order to spend some time with him. My parents are divorced, so when I'm with my mother, I see him less often than I do my mum. Anyway, I was with my father for like 30 minutes, and it was really nice. We arrived in the front of the building where I live with my mum. I said goodbye to him, and I went towards the building. I pushed the button of the intercom so that my mum would open the door, and then I saw a food deliverer with his motorcycle parked just next to me. He comes. So here he comes, which is obviously not a problem. I thought that he was going to deliver something to a neighbour. Nothing unusual here, but I don't know. There was just something off. Firstly, usually deliverers in Morocco, I don't know if this is the case in other countries, but certainly is here, have like a box where they store the food in order to keep it warm. But this guy, he didn't have one. He was just holding the bag with the food in his hand while riding the motorcycle. Also, he opened his phone like as if he was going to check a delivering app. But as I said, he didn't have the box or the logo of a delivering service anywhere on him. So even if my mother did unlock the door, I preferred not to open it and talk to this guy. I order from restaurants and fast food a lot, and I'm used to seeing deliverers and even talk a little bit with them from time to time to try and make them laugh and get to know them a bit. I know it's a hard job because of the people being jerks, so I don't know, I just try to be as friendly as I can. So I start saying hi to this guy, "How are you, bro?" in Moroccan, and the guy was pretty nice. He had a great smile and a nice way of talking, but he took time before answering me, like he was sort of, I don't know, like lagging or something. But it's okay, it happens. Maybe he was stressed or preoccupied, so nothing to worry about. I asked him what door number is it, and he replied 42, which is odd because the last door of the building is like the 14th, I think. So I told him to check the app, and then I tried to watch his phone, even though I'm not next to him, and instead of opening a delivering app, he opened WhatsApp and didn't even open a chat. Then he said, door 11. And at this moment, I knew something was wrong because I live at the 12th door, and so 11th door is right next to me, and I'm sure that my neighbours weren't the ones to order because they were on a trip. So at this point, I got a little bit stressed, and I told him that it must be an error because of the reason that I just told you guys, but he insisted to go in and told me that he's used to deliver at this address and that he knows where he needs to go, and he also tells me that the customer knows him and that he asked him to be quick because he liked his food to be as hot as possible. I said to this guy that I couldn't just let him enter the building, but that I was going to check if the guys of the 11th floor were back from their trip, and if so, I was going to let them know that he was here. I also told him that the guard of the building was usually in the cafe next by, and that he could go and talk to him if he wanted. I also lied to him and told him that my dad was waiting for me and that I just needed to go to the WC for a sec. He was angry at first, but he immediately changed his attitude and became sort of friendly again. I asked him to step aside, and then I asked again my mum to unlock the door and entered. I was still nervous, and while I was walking towards the elevator, I got really scared all of a sudden because I noticed that I didn't hear the door close behind me. I felt numb because I could have closed it myself, but at this moment I was sure that he had entered the building. I immediately started running towards the staircase, and at the same time, he tried to throw the bag that he was holding at me. I don't know why, but he missed. At this moment, I'm thinking really quickly. I also have Crohn's disease, which in short is a disease that causes inflammation of the intestines and a lot of pain, but according to my doctor, it also explains why I'm an anxious person and why I usually think too much. And so, I already thought in the past of a scenario where I needed to hide from something in the building. I know, it's weird, but I've come to the conclusion that the underground parking garage is the best place, because it's really large due to the fact that it was shared by 4 buildings. So I run as quickly as I can towards that staircase, and I immediately start going downstairs. Now, before I continue, I need to state that I'm a pretty tall guy. I'm like 6'3", and so it's difficult for me to hide quickly. I run, and I hear him chasing me, and at this moment, I remember that the other buildings have their own doors in the parking lot, so I run towards one of them. I see someone from afar and start screaming, a call and the caretaker of the building's name, quickly, but he didn't react and then enter one of the doors. I go upstairs, open the door of the building, and enter the bakery just next to it. Luckily, I find the caretaker, or the concierge, I don't know, I'm really not sure how to say it in English, and explain to him really quickly what's happening. He immediately got out of the bakery and started chasing this guy, but he was too far away and was running towards his motorcycle, so we couldn't catch him. I was tired of all of that running, but strangely, I wasn't really in shock or anything. And still, while sharing this, I feel a little bit, I don't know, maybe excited about what happened or something. Am I weird? I'm definitely not going to tell my parents because they'll forbid me to go out alone or take a taxi ever again. I tried to look out for the bag that he tried to throw at me, but it wasn't there anymore, and look, I know that I'm selfish for not calling the police and preferring not to worry about it, but honestly, they wouldn't do anything anyways. In the end, I don't know what that was all about. I have some suspicions that maybe it was a kidnapping attempt or something like that. All I know is that I'm glad that whoever that guy was, he didn't catch me. This has been going on for a couple of years now, but it hasn't gotten to me until now. I work as a paddling coach in Ottawa, Canada. I coach sprint kayak and canoe, dragon boat, stand-up paddleboard, and an assortment of other boats. I work year-round, but when the water opens up, I work out of a camp 10 minutes outside of the city. The club is surrounded by deep woods and several other camps. The plot of the land next to where I work is owned by the YMCA and used for a summer camp, but the camp only takes about a quarter of the area. The rest of the forest is filled with a spider web of deepwood trails that go on for like kilometers. I used to train my athletes on the trails, but for a couple of years now we haven't been allowed to use them. Anytime we go on the trails now, a representative of the YMCA usually comes and kicks us off. So, it all started about 2 years ago. I was upriver, a ways, coaching a dragon boat session. We were paddling alongside the shoreline owned by the YMCA, and just as we were taking a break, I heard the most chilling scream coming from the woods, not too far from the shore. It sounded like a woman's, but it sounded really off, as though she was struggling to get air or something. The whole boat stopped moving and stopped to listen. It was quiet for a long time until I asked if anyone had heard that. A dragon boat holds 22 people, and just as I asked, everyone looked at me and nodded. People were quiet for a while to see if it would happen again. This first incident happened late in the summer, so I assumed that it was just a camp kid screaming at a bug or something. I mean, it happens. When we didn't hear it again, we decided to continue the workout. Just as we got going, however, it happened again. Still, the same gargled sort of scream just beyond the tree line, and again, everyone in the boat stopped to listen. I wasn't 100% sure what to do, to be honest. I mean, I had never dealt with anything like this before. It was one of those things that you question constantly, not sure if what you heard was legit or not. I beached the dragon boat on shore just so that we could take a look. Everyone was guessing that the source of the scream could be more than beyond the tree line. A couple of guys and me took a look around, but couldn't see anything. It was honestly a really chilling situation. We all eventually decided to call it a day, though, and head back. I assumed it was just a campground hiking the trails, and it eventually left my mind. Flash forward to last summer, though, and I heard the screams again, only a handful of times, though, over the season. I can't say how many times, but it couldn't have been more than 3. Each time it would happen, me and whoever I was with could never find where it was coming from, though. It was always the stretch of beach owned by the YMCA, never anywhere else. This all happened over different points of the summer, and it was never just one part of the season. I want to say that this wasn't the only weird stuff that was going on at that club. Besides the odd disembodied screaming, myself and others would hear a few different sounds coming from the woods by the club. This would include a weird sort of rasping wind blowing through the forest, immediately followed by the sound of what can only be described as someone gutting a fish, but really loudly. It's really hard to explain, but I want to do the sound justice because it just has chilled me to the bone every time that I've heard it. But the worst thing that I've experienced at work is somewhat too common nowadays. It usually happens when I have my younger training group with me. With this group, I coach mostly sprint canoe and sprint kayak, and the group ranges in age from the youngest being 12 to the oldest being 17. I train the kids after school, and sometimes we go late to just before the sun sets. Sometimes I'm stuck closing up the club in the dark with the kids, which is when this usually happens too. From time to time, when it's just on the cusp of being dark out, me and my athletes hear footsteps coming from the woods that surround us. They always just stop short of the tree line, and it doesn't sound like someone running through the trails or anything, but as if someone is walking through the underbrush. Just as we hear it, me and the kids always fall silent and look to the exact same place. This usually prompts everyone to drop whatever they're doing and hightail it to the parking lot to drive off. Now, all of this would have been fine. I mean, I'm a pretty tough guy, I guess. I don't scare easy. At least I didn't think so. But a couple of days ago, something finally put me over the edge. You see, it's been an exceptionally warm spring in Canada, which has allowed me to start work on the water 3 to 4 weeks earlier than usual. I was out on the water with the dragon boat crew, and we were paddling up and down the range of beach owned by the YMCA. And again, it happened. Everyone stopped paddling and just sort of stared at the stretch of beach that we always do. But the scream sounded different now. Still female, but the best way to describe it is really demonic. All of my hair stood on end. The whole boat laughed awkwardly, assuming that it was just a member of the club or a member of the YMCA hiking the old trails, but I didn't laugh. It hit me almost immediately. It couldn't have been a member of our club because I was the last booking of the night, and it couldn't have been any of the members of the YMCA because it was too early in the season. The YMCA camp hasn't been opened for the season yet. That was the other night, and quite honestly, I haven't decided what to do yet. The whole thing has put me on edge, and I haven't allowed myself to stay later than 8 these last couple of days. I'm certainly not a usual on these sorts of channels, I guess you could say, but I thought that I needed to get my story out there. It isn't just me either. I've talked to the other coaches at the club, and all of them have heard the screams. We all just don't know what to do about it, to be honest. The screams usually happen a couple of times a summer, and usually in twos, so I'll try to get a video of it happening if I can, and I'll share it with you guys. Anyway, thanks for listening, and do wish me the best, as I don't know what to do now. So this morning I was napping on my couch when I heard my dog start barking and growling at my patio door. I got up and peeked around the curtain to see what got them riled up like this, and when I did, I saw 3 kids in my driveway. One older boy looked to be around maybe 13 or 14, a younger boy maybe around 10, and a younger girl looked to be around maybe 7 years old. They were all blonde and pale. I was obviously creeped out by this, but I ignored it, and I went back to lay down, hoping that they would just go away. I mean, they're just kids after all. But a few minutes later, I heard a noise at my front door, so I peeked around the corner and saw the little girl looking in my window, and her eyes were completely black. Like, there was no color in them whatsoever. Even where the whites should be, they were completely dark. Obviously, I didn't answer the door, and I just sort of hid in my living room until eventually they seemed to leave. Now, I don't want to say that I'm entirely sure that this absolutely happened, because I do tend to have very vivid dreams when I take my morning nap. But this time, it felt really real, and I was walking around, I'm sure of it. I truly hope that it was just some weird dream or something, but anyway, I just wanted to share this and get your thoughts. I was a 16-year-old girl and an avid runner. I ran anywhere from 4 to 10 miles a day. I had a few parks that I rotated through and decided one day after school and before work to run at this pretty secluded park next to the river. It was a really hot day and I knew this park had a lot of shade, so I thought that would be really good. Now, I usually carried a knife or pepper spray with me, but forgot it at home this time and didn't really have time to go back home before work. Coming in, I noticed a few mums with their kids at the playground, and what I believed to be one of the children's grandpas watching the kids play. I love kids, so I always enjoy seeing them. Cut to me running my laps, though, and it was getting closer to dinner time, and the families all started to slowly leave. This park was 2 laps per mile, so I was on the second half of mile 3 when I noticed all of the mums and the kids were just all of a sudden gone. I was a little bit uncomfortable since I believed that I was all alone in this park at this point. I guess something about when the mums were there just comforted me. But now I was alone, or so I thought at least. I'm nearly finished with mile 3 when, out of the corner of my eye, I see a grandpa starting to walk the track coming my way. I'm confused since I believed that he was with the kids earlier, but now all of a sudden the kids were gone. I didn't see another car in the lot besides mine as well. And to make things even more creepy, he was sucking on a lollipop. It was random, but somehow added to the creep factor, I guess, for me at least. My body was telling me to flee, but I'm a stubborn teenager who was determined to run 4 miles that day. I figured that I would just run past him and be able to move on with my run. I mean, it's not like he would outrun me, right? Anyway, I'm about 3 steps from him and doing all I can to pretend that I don't see him, acting like I'm super focused and can't be bothered. Just as I thought that I had made it past him successfully, he somehow grabs the wire of my headphones, no earpods since this was back in 2010, and pulls them out of my ears. I turn around at him absolutely livid, but as a woman, I know that I have to play nice to try and lessen my chance of being murdered or something. So I look at him, smile and say, "Are you okay?" He takes a long pause, still sucking on that lollipop, then pulls it out and shows me this really creepy grin that sends shivers down my spine. He looks me up and down and says, "Like to play alone, huh?" while grabbing a piece of my blonde hair that was in a ponytail. I smacked his hand off my hair and sprinted as fast as I think that I ever have back to my car at this point. I had a 1994 Saturn that could only be unlocked manually with a key, so like any horror movie, it takes me a ridiculous amount of attempts to get this key in the hole. All the while, I can hear him walking towards me, slow and steady. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was most likely only a few seconds, I unlocked my car and jumped in. I locked the door and soon after the old man was almost to my car. I start the engine and start to back out of my parking spot. I see the man try to get behind my car, but luckily I was quick enough, so he wasn't able to. I booked it out of the parking lot and I didn't look back. Now, obviously, I don't know what his plans were. I don't know why he was watching those children play, and I don't know how the heck he kept a lollipop in his mouth so long without it melting away like that. I'm just really glad that I didn't stick around to find out what his plans were. Fast forward to now, though, and I'm 28 years old and have still never returned to that park, even though it's the closest park to my house. Hopefully, that man is long gone, but I, for one, am not gonna go and look and see. My dad lives near a woodland track that's perfect for dog walking, and during COVID, he got a dog which I've not really had much interaction with due to the nearly 2 years of restrictions. This dog can become anxious though and worried when she can't find someone that she recognizes. So we decided that the best way to get her comfortable with me would be to take her for a walk along the track. I would let her off the lead, and if she wandered too far, call her name to get her back. It was towards the end of this walk that stuff got really creepy very quickly, though. You see, it starts getting dark, and we're nearing the end of the track and the beginning of the main road back home. I call the dog back to put her lead on. All is fine, until she's back by my side. Because just as I'm leaning down to put her lead back on, I hear a noise in the woods. My dad's dog hears it too, and nearly sprints after it. I manage to get her lead on in time, though, and look towards the noise. Then I hear it again. A voice. A voice calling my dog's name, just as I have been all walk. And I don't just mean saying the same name. I mean trying its hardest to copy my voice. I feel like I'm completely frozen in place. I didn't want to turn my head from the woods in case whoever this was came running out at me. I was praying that I was just hearing things, but then, just like the time before, but this time from a spot closer to us, the voice called out for my dog again. It was at this point that I grabbed the dog and I ran. I didn't hear the voice again, and eventually I got out of this place and I went back home. And while I realized that this was a very brief encounter, it's still one of the most terrifying situations that I've ever found myself in. So I was out one morning, late for school, and decided, hey, I'm already late, what will it hurt to get something to eat? So I stop by a McDonald's and I go in. It's like 7 in the morning and there's nobody in there but this guy and his kid. The man offers to buy me breakfast, as it's pouring rain and you look like you could talk to someone. I figure, sure, free meal, why not? So he orders me food and I sit down at the table with him and his kid. I'm not sure if they were a girl or a boy, to be honest, but they were short and had this big hoodie on, messy hair, the works. This guy, on the other hand, was a solid 6'5", well-dressed and super sociable. He sat down and started talking about God and his church and all this other stuff. But the whole time his kid was picking their breakfast burrito apart and staring at me. They had marker all over their fingers, like they'd dipped their hands into ink or something. They looked like the only thing keeping them awake was, I don't know, terror. The guy excused himself to the bathroom at one point, and his kid slid a piece of paper over to me with what looked like crudely scribbled on with horns labeled neon and effing garbage. That definitely freaked me out, and I left after that. I have no clue how old this kid was, but I'd say maybe 12. It wasn't horrifying, but the combo of his hobo demon child glaring at me as they ripped up napkins and scribbled creepy drawings and ate their burrito in a sort of demented manner, contrasted by the dad being overly polite and excessively talking about God and bringing people to the light and salvation and stuff like that, made me super uncomfortable and scared the daylights out of me. I don't know. I think that there was something more going on. In any case, these days, I use the drive-thru only now. So before I begin this, I would like to say first that I've always believed in the paranormal, even though this was the first time that I'd ever witnessed something supernatural like this. Also, English isn't my first language, so I apologize for anything that sounds a bit weird. So, I, an 18-year-old male, live in northwestern France, Normandy, and it's not a place with endless forests. In fact, it's pretty flat and boring for the most part. Since I was a kid, I would stay there for 2 weeks during the spring holidays at my grandparents' house in the Jura region in eastern France. The Jura region is a really hilly place with a lot of forests and amazing wildlife, so it's pretty much the opposite of where I'm from. During my time here, I usually go deep into the woods to pick mushrooms and berries, and I never really saw anything weird. The animals that you see there are like deer, foxes, badgers, wild boars, squirrels, rabbits, and very recently, even some wolves have been back in this area of France. Now, if I remember correctly, it was the 2nd of May 2022, and as I said, I was in the forest near the village of Gyron to pick berries. I was alone there. There was nobody around, but it was not something like strange or anything because it's a very sparsely populated part of France. But the thing that did feel strange was the fact that I didn't see any animals. No deer, no wild boars, no foxes. In fact, it was eerily silent. I'm not going to lie, I was starting to get a little bit uncomfortable because the silence was making me a little bit scared, but I decided to keep picking berries because my mum wanted to make some pies and I love her pies. As I was walking in the woods, I could see a clearing and I was thinking about taking a break in this place because I've been walking for like almost an hour at this point. That was until I saw a very big, dark mass that was bipedal and it was standing in the clearing. I stopped walking and I was staring at this thing behind the trees for like 20 seconds before I just turned tail and I ran back to the village. Now, to give a bit of a description, it was very tall and hairy, probably maybe 7 foot. Perhaps the best way that I can describe it too is that it looked like a bipedal wolf or like a half dog, sort of half human. And I don't know if this thing saw me, but ever since then, I've never put a foot back in that forest again. When I got back to my grandparents' house, I gave my mum the berries that I'd picked and I stayed in my room for the rest of the day. I conducted a lot of research about the wildlife in this region to see if what I saw was some kind of a rare animal or something, but no. What I saw, as far as I can tell, was not an animal at all. While conducting the research, I did stumble across a story from the 16th century, though. It's the story of a werewolf that apparently was destroying children in the village of Jura. It was in a place called Amange, and even though Amange is pretty far from Gyron, it's still in the Jura area, so there is a possible connection, I guess. In any case, I was really freaked out by this discovery, but I wanted to know more about werewolves and stories like that in this part of France, so I watched a 2-hour-long video about 2 women who were talking about what they saw in the Jura. When I looked at the drawing that one of the women in the video did, my heart stopped because, I'm telling you, it looked exactly like what I saw that day. Now, I know that werewolves are a part of the Jura folklore. There's even a celebration that takes place the last weekend of June to celebrate the story of the werewolf of Amange. But since this experience, I just haven't been able to sleep well at my grandparents' house because, I don't know, I always feel like I'm just being watched or something. The view from my window is nothing but a big forest, so it's really not reassuring. But I'm back in Normandy since May of 9th, but I'm thinking about it every day, and now I want to go back. I didn't tell anyone about this sighting yet because I don't want to sound crazy and I don't have any pictures to prove that I'm not lying, but I don't know, maybe I could get something. What do you guys think? Am I crazy? I'm a real estate agent who works and lives in a small town in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountain. I work alongside my husband at his family-owned agency that has been here since the 70s. We rarely sell homes or represent buyers for homes that are more than like an hour outside of our area, but occasionally when I have an appointment with a client close to the highway that takes me one up the mountain, I take the opportunity to drive another 30 minutes towards my favorite scenic mountain overlook. It was a rainy day in May that I needed to assess the progress of a house under construction. This house was only 30 minutes away from this overlook. I decided after assessing that the house had little to no progress since the last time that I drove past it, so I would head towards the overlook. There was nothing unusual about this rainy day until I turned left onto the highway leading me to the overlook. several yards before coming to a stop sign, I noticed a black bird in the middle of the road that appeared sort of indifferent towards me, driving straight for it. The bird's response time was delayed for a clean getaway. I heard its body fly right into the grill of my Ford, crunching its fragile bones, and looking in the rearview mirror with a distraught face, I saw that I cleaned its head right off. Now, I'm not a crazily superstitious person, but I do believe in signs, whether positive or negative, that the world provides before events unfold. I told myself, this cannot be good. And after maybe driving 10 or so minutes up the mountain, the light rain turned into a pour, making the road slick, the fog thick, and extremely difficult to drive. At this point, I could feel something telling me to just turn back. I felt as though something was off, and justified that it was a feeling of guilt for killing that innocent black bird back there. I kept driving. 5 minutes passed, and I wasn't far away from the overlook. For the last 25 minutes I'd been driving, nobody was behind me until now. A small red Tacoma truck that had a porta-john in its bed was tailing my car. I figured that I would lose the truck since it would probably continue to the highway as I would turn left towards the overlook. But to my unfortunate surprise, it followed me and proceeded to inch even closer to my vehicle. I was slightly panicking as the rain poured even harder and the fog made it that much more difficult to see the road in front of me. 2 minutes away from the overlook, I noticed a white truck with its lights turned on and pulled off the side of the road. The car looked as though it was waiting for someone, but what a peculiar place to wait since, there's really nothing there. The red truck is still on my tail, and just as I was sure that he would run off the mountain, I found the overlook to my left, swerved into its parking lot, and finally let out a huge sigh of relief. But it was very short-lived. I looked to my left a few yards away. The small red Tacoma truck was parked, as well as at the overlook parking lot. For a few minutes, I sat in my car thinking to myself, maybe he's just taking a lunch break, or perhaps he just couldn't see anything past the fog and doesn't want to chance driving in these conditions. A few more minutes passed, and the individual driving the red truck opened his door to get outside, and in his arms, he was holding a gun. He was a 5'8", grimy man with black hair, around his mid-40s with a toothpick in his mouth, overalls with a strap hanging off, and a shotgun that would make the bravest of men cower. He was making strides towards my car, but I didn't want to wait for him to reach his destination. I trembled with immense fear and immediately started my car, and I headed in the direction that I'd come from. The grimy man didn't follow me in his small red truck, but the white truck parked off the side of the road from earlier was on my tail again and driving even more recklessly than the man with the shotgun. The rain was finally starting to lighten up a bit, but the fog lingered way longer than I wished it did. He drove on my tail for 10 minutes until I finally lost him in the fog and quickly turned right back onto the road. I was relieved that it didn't turn into an impasse on the mountain because, to be honest, who knows what would have happened if it had been like that. I lived in a 100 to 150-year-old house, according to the landlord anyway. For 6 months-ish, while my family was renovating our home, it was a very old house with a creepy basement and a hidden second staircase behind the kitchen. There were 4 bedrooms, 2 vacant, the one that I slept in and the one my parents slept in. The one my parents slept in had a walk-in closet with a window in it where you could look through and see the top of the stairs. I always thought that it was strange, and it'll be an important detail later, so keep it in mind. So, we moved in when I was around 15, or I had just turned 15, that is. The memories are a little bit foggy, but I'll try my best to remember everything. So, the first instance of activity that I can remember was the night that I moved in, and it was pretty passive, as I would call it anyway. I remember sitting up alone in my room after unpacking a couple of boxes, and I was listening to a CD on this old stereo that my parents had bought. My parents were downstairs watching TV, I think. and I remember everything just being, well, pretty fine. It was late at night and it was dark, the only light on upstairs being my room. The hall was pitch black, and I should add that I had never been scared of the dark except for when I was a young kid. But I remember pausing my music because I could have swore that I heard footsteps, and I thought my dad was coming up the stairs to tell me to turn it down. He did that a lot. But I still heard him talking to my mum downstairs. It felt, though, like someone was standing in the doorway, and I remember feeling really unsettled. The feeling didn't leave me too, and I sat there for a solid 5 minutes, putting my music back on to try and ease my mind, but it still felt distinctly like someone was standing there, staring at me in the doorway. I couldn't see anyone, obviously, but I remember getting so spooked out that I hurried downstairs and I joined my parents in the living room. I said that I felt creeped out, and my mum said that it was probably just being in a new place and I'd settle down and get used to it eventually. Bearing in mind that this was my first ever experience of the paranormal, and I had never felt like this before. I was convinced that somebody was upstairs though, but my parents, they just brushed it off. Now, this sort of thing persisted for a few days, but only when I was somewhere alone. My mum refuses to talk about the house, so I've never found out if either of my parents had the same experiences, but given her defensiveness on it, I presume that she must have. Less passive things, though, started happening after this. At first, I dismissed it. Things like the pool balls on the table being moved when I returned to the games room, even when I knew that I put them there in their little triangle formation for the game. But when I'd come back, they'd be scattered across the table like someone broke them and started the game without me. Small things would go missing too and reappear somewhere else, or move very slightly, but just sort of nuisance things like that. Things one could disregard as just forgetting something. This persisted for a while, and I didn't tell my parents about it because I didn't think anything of it. I remember though when things got more intense. I'd start to get chills right before something would happen, in fact. The room would get freezing cold for no explainable reason. The house did have many drafts, but it wasn't enough to make the room from like lukewarm to freezing cold in a few seconds like that. That was something weird. And then something would always happen, like an object would fall, or I'd hear a noise and the room would go back to being warm again, like nothing had changed. The first time that I felt truly scared was when I woke up in the bed in the middle of the night and I felt like something was staring at me. I always slept with my door shut, and it felt like a stranger was standing in my room, over me, watching me sleep. I had a shelf of books and various ornaments above my bed. My bed was against the wall, and I remember 3 of them falling on my legs and feet, one right after the other, and then everything just went completely quiet again. Nothing else happened that night, and I fell back asleep, which was difficult, but I would also hear tapping on my door at various points in the night, and I was awake for a couple of those occasions too. One night I couldn't sleep, and I heard 3 taps on my door. Admittedly, they were very quiet, like somebody had tapped a single fingernail against the door 3 times. But there was this one night where this happened multiple times, but the tapping would always come in 3s. Then it would be silent for about half an hour, and then I would hear it again. In those beginning 3 weeks, looking back on it, the activity was like your standard haunting, I guess. Just nuisance and creepy things. But it was about a month into living there that things got super intense for me, and quite honestly, really scary. It was like the intensity scale went from 0 to 100 within a few days. Well, at least that's what it felt like. It was such a drastic change from the odd disturbance to actual violent events that I couldn't explain it. One evening, I was in the house alone, only for about an hour. I was rarely ever in the house alone, to be honest. There was always such a foul feeling about it that I avoided it, and I felt unsafe ever being there by myself at this point. My family had to be there, or else I would just go out and wait out by the back door until they got home from work in my school uniform. I felt entirely on edge the entire time. I couldn't sit still, I couldn't focus on homework or the TV, music, nothing. I just kept feeling that same feeling, like someone was watching me, but it felt worse somehow because I was alone, I guess. I couldn't run to anyone to feel better. It was just me and whatever this was. I remember I was trying to focus on some movie or on the TV, and the room all of a sudden went cold again, and I was instantly like, oh no, what do I do? By now, I had figured out that what I was dealing with was some sort of a spirit, and I was very familiar with the concept of ghosts and hauntings, but I didn't believe any of it until I moved into this place. I remember the movie was just ending and the screen went dark on the credits screen, and I could see my own reflection in the TV. And I saw something very distinct rush behind me, past me, and presumably through the door into the kitchen. You had to walk through the living room to get to this kitchen, and it was like a tall black smoky figure, but it had no distinguishing shape. What I mean is that it had like no humanoid figure. It was almost like just a bundle of half-transparent black smoke that just sort of shot past in half a second. Seriously, like one blink and I would have missed it. Now, I'm not going to say that I acted tough in this moment or that I was brave or anything. I literally just burst into tears because I was terrified. And somehow seeing it made all my fears a reality that I couldn't pass off as an excuse anymore. My parents obviously didn't believe a word that I told them, so I just stopped telling them anything, and they didn't help, making me think that I was delusional and perhaps even crazy. I saw it again too, a total of 4 separate occasions. The second being when I was in a walk-in closet in my parents' bedroom looking for something. I can't remember what it was, but I remember peeking out of the weird window that I told you about earlier and seeing a black shadow for a few seconds on the stairs, and it just sort of faded away. The third occasion was a tall black mist standing still in the corner of my room. I woke up and I felt paralyzed. That was my first experience ever of sleep paralysis too, and I remember seeing it in my peripheral vision, standing in the corner of my room until I regained, consciousness, I guess you could call it, in my body, and when I could move, I turned to face it, and it had just disappeared. This one you might be able to discount as a hallucination. I'm aware of that because I know people experience sleep paralysis and weird things like this, so take that one with a grain of salt, I guess. But the fourth and final time, I saw it fully, and it was in the kitchen. I was writing out a French exam, I'm pretty sure, or something to do with French class, and I turned and saw it rush through the kitchen door into the living room. I don't know why I saw it. I don't know if it was showing itself to me or something, because I've never seen another spirit since, and I've lived in multiple homes, perhaps even haunted ones. The worst experience, however, was yet to come. There's 2 that sort of tie hand in hand with the worst experiences in this house, which convinced me that this thing did not have good intentions. You see, I felt touches and what felt like light shoves sometimes, especially when I was on the stairs. I'd feel like a cold, icy breeze against my shoulder, like something was running their hand really quickly across my skin. The worst day for me, though, was when I was upstairs alone. You see, I went into the 3rd bedroom. It was used as a storage room, and that room was always cold, freezing even. Even if you stuck a heater in there, it would just never really seem to warm up. But I remember that I went into the room and started rifling through boxes, and I was looking for something. I remember sitting back because I could just smell something rotten. Not like that sickly, moldy, sweet smell that is like rotten food or fruit. If you've ever smelt a dog food box that sort of exploded and left to go moldy, then you'll know what the type of smell that I'm talking about is. It was absolutely putrid. and it honestly just came out of nowhere. And I just remember a box at the end of the room shaking, gently, sort of back and forth. I looked at it, and it was just a box of books. There wasn't anything significant, just a random storage box. Trying not to be sick at the same time as watching this, mind you, the smell was making me gag every second, and I was just glued to my spot on the floor watching this box move on its own. And the feeling in that room was so heavy all of a sudden. It was like the air was physically pressing down on my skin and my chest, and it was really hard to breathe all of a sudden. I couldn't think. All I could feel was anger and fear. I don't even know where the anger came from, to be honest. Maybe being angry at this thing for making me feel threatened in my own home? I'm not sure, but that's how I felt at the time, and I remember it. I also remember when the box slid a few centimeters. It didn't slide by much, but after it slid, it was still, and the smell just, all of a sudden, faded away. But that entire day, I felt like something was almost sitting on my shoulders. My entire body felt so heavy, and I felt really tired and grouchy, and I was lashing out at everyone around me in this blind anger that I couldn't explain. I went to bed early because I felt so tired that day, and I remember waking up the next morning and I had 3 lovely bright red scratches across the top of my arm, and I knew that I didn't do them. One of the reasons too is because I'm a very bad nail biter. I haven't really got any nails to speak of, and definitely did not back then. The entire remainder of the time that I stayed there though, and for quite some time after, I just couldn't shake this feeling, this heavy feeling that I had. It always felt like I had a chain strapped to my ankle. Every breath, every step felt heavy. I was always so tired and sort of depressed all the time. Ever since that day in the room with the box, it's like, I don't know, everything just changed for me. Everything was flipped upside down, and my happiness just tanked. And even 6 years later, things are just not the same. So, I guess my question for you guys is, does anyone have any idea as to what all this was? And if you do, is there anything that I can do to change this? To go back to a time before any of this happened? I was in Juvie as a kid pretty often. I ended up doing 4 months out of the 6-month sentence for possession with intent to distribute and probation violation, which was the longest that I'd gone to the Juvie. Ghost stories have been shared amongst the kids in there fairly often. The DOs, detention officers, would chime in time to time to tell theirs as well. Some were pretty hard to buy because it's juvenile and there isn't much to do besides tell stories, especially when talking through vents and toilets. But one night, it was time for lockdown, bedtime, so we all turned in our stuff and headed in our cells. This time of night, someone is usually talking to you through a vent, so we'd stay up a little bit after lockdown, unless you were tired. Sometimes we'd just mess around and even holler out the cell door saying insults to one another or egging on the DOs to come into the pod just to annoy them. And this night, we honestly thought that someone was just messing around again. Because we hear what sounds like wailing, like someone pretending to be in pain echoing through a cell door, and so a lot of the kids were yelling for them to shut up and banging on the cell doors to get them to stop. A lot of threats were thrown out towards whoever was making the noise. But then, the wailing sounded like someone was actually in pain, guttural moaning and groaning, sounds you would hear from someone dying perhaps. Absolutely terrifying to hear. I started to get chills down my back because it sounded unreal. Finally, though, the DOs came in and turned on the lights and started calling out for whoever it was, seeing as someone sounded like they needed medical assistance. They opened all of the doors and told us all to step out so they could figure out who needs help. But the sound kept going, even after we all stepped out and lined up downstairs. The sound seemed to be coming from the second level, from a cell that no one was inside of. 2 DOs went up and opened the door, and the wailing kept going. The DOs radioed it in, saying that there's nobody in the cell and that they were openly talking about how creeped out they were. And then a DO rushed down the stairs and told another DO we all needed to leave the pod. We grabbed our blankets and moved to the pod across the way. All the while, this wailing was continuing. It was genuinely like something out of a horror movie. Now, while we were waiting in the other pod for new cells to be assigned, the lights in the pod that we were in had started to flicker. The look of horror on the kids' faces and the faces of the DOs sent goosebumps over my entire body as we were all witnessing this. One DO even told us that we needed to pray, so we all grabbed hands and began praying. Kids that hated each other were grabbing hands and praying. That's how wild this was. Eventually, we were all sent into our new cells and down for the night. The next morning, we were telling all the kids in the new pod about what happened, and they were really shook. One DO had told us him and the other DOs had seen a black-figured cloak floating around in the pod around midnight, stopping at different cells. We never got moved back into that pod the rest of the time that we were there. I saw that they ended up making it a rec room for the blue shirts, the kids with more privileges because of good behavior, the last time that I was around there, anyway. When I was 10, I was riding my bike home from a friend's house when I encountered something. I live far north and it was mid-December, so we were about halfway through the 3-month blackout. It was dark 24 hours a day. It was late afternoon, but if it wasn't for the streetlights that lined every street, I wouldn't have been able to see a thing. I had to pedal slow because I was bundled up in not only my heavy clothes, but also my windproof coveralls, because we were pre-blizzard. I stopped halfway up the hill that led to my street to take a puff of my inhaler and rest my legs. After my breathing slowed, I was able to hear a panting sound behind me, I thought. I turned around, expecting to see Petey, the coyote hybrid stray that was basically owned by the entire town. He was super friendly and was known to check on children when they were outside on their own. But Petey wasn't there. Thinking that my hearing was still a little fuzzy due to an inner ear infection that I had just gotten over, I shrugged it off and dismounted my bike. It was easier to walk alongside it at this point, and as I was nearing my street, I felt a hot breath on the small bit of ankle that was exposed between my overalls and rolled down socks. Immediately, I stopped and looked around again. I was raised by a very superstitious family. My pawpaw always says, if something seems to be a little off, then you're not perceptive enough. After a moment of surveying my surroundings, I saw a 4-legged form sort of trotting up the street behind me. It was too small to be Petey, but too thin to be a wolf or a lost hunting dog, so I began moving again, realizing that this was not an animal that I could predict. I kept my eyes on it and walked slow, just in case it was a very malnourished wolf that was looking for something to eat. It was only when I turned slowly onto my street that the animal started walking quickly. Its movements were so strange though, and it made sort of grunting noises that almost sounded human, I guess. When it suddenly began running, I pushed my bike back towards it and dashed up the hill towards my house. Our street was essentially a dirt road that turned into our driveway. The dirt was muddy from melted snow and I kept slipping. Rocks cut my hands from stopping myself from hitting the ground and my tiny ankles kept rolling. At one point, I couldn't catch myself in time and ended up sliding a few feet downhill. That's when I felt a searing pain on the back of my left leg. I cried out and rolled over to kick the animal off of me. That was also when I got a good look at my attacker. It was definitely a canine of some kind, but strangely it didn't have any hair. Its skin looked like black metal under the flickering streetlight overhead. I didn't get a good full look at it though, because I immediately began kicking at it with the leg that wasn't pinned by its paws and teeth. 2 good strikes to its side had it whimpering and jumping back just enough for me to scramble to my feet and begin running again. I could feel blood rolling down my leg as my house came into view. I could still hear the dog growling as it sprinted after me. I screamed from my mums as I approached the front porch, praying that they were home and that their guns were nearby. Aga opened the door less than a moment after hearing my shouts. She says that all she saw was me half running, half crawling sort of up the driveway, and that was all it took for her to run outside in her pajamas and bare feet. She heard a sort of howling noise as she picked me up and ran back up the steps. We got inside, just as Katie was running out of the den with her 50-year-old AR-7. The rifle only worked like 40% of the time, but it was the only weapon that wasn't locked up in their bedroom closet. I wrapped my arms and legs around Aga and buried my face in her neck, sobbing violently. She could feel the warm blood from my leg against her back, and she immediately rushed into the kitchen to call Katie's mother, Mary. She was staying at my Aunt Gloria's house. She was a nurse, and she would be better than any doctor or shaman in town. Cannery, which is what I called her at the time, could hear my cries in the receiver and immediately got moving. Gloria, like everyone else in my family, lived on the same property, so it wouldn't take her long. Katie came in after about 10 minutes of scanning the perimeter of the house. She was soaked from the sleet that had started falling, and her hands were freezing when she ran in and started examining my face and neck. By then, Aga had gotten me to sit on the large ironwood dining room table, and they worked together to get the several layers of clothing removed from my stiff body. I was still in shock and couldn't really assist them in the painstaking process. Cannery and Gloria arrived just as they were getting me down to my long johns. Glory had called my Uncle Cal and Pawpaw before they left her house. I remember hearing this too and just feeling a relief unlike any other. In my mind, they were and still are the strongest men in the world. If something hurt me, they would make sure that it would never come here again. The 4 women, though, panicked when they saw the source of all the blood that I had lost. There were 5 large gashes, about 5 inches long, and each one being about half an inch wide. Luckily, Cannery essentially had everything that she needed to treat the wounds, but she was adamant about getting me a tetanus and rabies vaccine ASAP. Cal and Pawpaw gathered a posse, and the large group combed the woods and streets of the town. There was a lockdown due to the possibility of this being a rabid animal. Everyone stayed inside for nearly 24 hours, until the men were able to confirm the coast was clear. Whatever had attacked me, it was gone now. Now, when I was finally cleaned up with a drain put in my wounds, Cal sat down beside me on my parents' bed and asked me to recall everything that happened leading up to the attack. He asked if I had remembered smelling salt water, if I remember seeing pawpaw prints fading on the asphalt or anything, if I remembered hearing chains rattling or stuff like this. Honestly, until he started asking me all of this, I didn't really entertain the idea that this was supernatural. I thought it was just a sickly wolf or a coyote who wanted to claim one more victim before going into the woods to die. Pawpaw drew up some sketches for me though and asked if any of them looked like what attacked me. When I pointed out the one that most resembled the Hairless beast, he immediately kissed me and he hugged me close. My Pawpaw is a very stoic Inuit man who never physically showed affection, so this was really strange to say the least. My mums tell me that when I was a baby, he only held me a handful of times and it was always stiff. He loved me and they assured me of that, but he would never tell me as such. So, when he pulled away from the embrace and stroked my hair with tears in his eyes, I became weirdly afraid. I remember asking him if I needed to go to the hospital and his small chuckle in response. Without a word, he left, leaving Aga to assure me that I wouldn't be crossing the pearly gates anytime soon. I learnt later, though, that in the 1950s, Pawpaw had a friend that went by the name of Howdy. He was also Inuit, and the two of them had basically grown up together. When they were both 15, Paw had joined Howdy on a hunting trip about 100 miles north of our property. This took place during the blackout as well, and as they trekked through the thick brush of the tundra, Paw could remember seeing Howdy about 5 feet ahead of him, but suddenly, he just wasn't there anymore. There was a howl, a scream, and a growl before the overgrowth to Paw's right began to rustle violently. Before he could react, it just went completely silent. He found Howdy's body about 10 yards away from the path. He was mauled and mangled to the point of being pretty much unrecognizable, but Paw knew that it was his buddy. It took him 2 days to carry Howdy back to his truck so that he could drive him home, and throughout the arduous hike, Paw could see large paw prints in the mud ahead of him. Each time he drew closer, they would disappear, and when he was finally to the truck and setting Howdy up in the bed of it, he saw what he knew was responsible for ending his friend's life. A keelet, something he'd only read about, was pacing the edge of the trail watching Paw with small but piercing eyes. Not unlike the legends of other black dogs, these are large and black, and in this case hairless, canines that were known to attack travelers and kill them. From the legends told in our village, it was rare to survive an encounter with one of these things, but those who did immediately went mad. As far as I know, I never went mad. Surprisingly too, my wound healed in practically no time, and the only thing that I had left of the encounter were horrific nightmares, a fear of the blackout, and a few scars. Arga maintains that despite a disturbing life on our property, the most traumatizing thing that she's ever experienced was watching me scramble helplessly up our muddy driveway. She says that the screams that tore through my throat were what she imagined perhaps a damned spirit would sound like. I truly feel like I'm just going insane. This has been occurring for months now, and what began as slight anxiety is now intense paranoia. You see, every night I hear my cat outside my window crying. Not meowing, but crying. Cat owners will understand what I mean. The first night, I walked outside without hesitation and called my cat. When that didn't work, I worried that his legs or paws may have been hurt, which would explain the crying, so I went and searched for him with my phone flashlight. That detail is important because, as you probably know, phone flashlights are not that bright. So when I saw something moving in the bushes, it was impossible to tell if it was my cat or not. What I do know is that when I gave up and chalked his behavior up to being a brat, because let's be real, what cat comes when they're called, right? And it's no stretch for him to whine for no reason. I walked back inside my house to find my cat curled up and sleeping on my couch. Now, there's just no way that he somehow got past me walking through the door without my knowledge. But still, I brushed it off because I suppose anything is possible, right? The next night it happened was about a week later, and by then I had forgotten about the first weird experience. Only when I looked to the foot of my bed and remembered my cat had been with me the entire time, it all of a sudden came rushing back. I'm the girl who makes fun of horror movie characters for being so stupid, so when I sort of walked outside in morbid curiosity, let me honestly tell you that I have never retrospectively hated myself more. I went to my window and the crying was so clear that it had to be coming from within a few feet, but I didn't see anything, which was strange because I definitely saw something the first night. It was around this time that the creepiness of it all really hit me, and I all but ran back inside. I swore then that my cat had lost his nighttime privileges and would be indoors by sundown, and I wouldn't be investigating this anymore, naively thinking that it would just go away. But it has just gotten way worse. That was months ago, and the crying occurs almost nightly now. Barring a couple of nights of feline rebellion, I've been vigilant about keeping him indoors at night, so I know for a fact that whatever I'm hearing is definitely not my cat. But it sounds just like him, and it's so realistic. Now, before you comment saying that it was another cat, don't bother. I know what my cat sounds like. I'm a proud cat mum, and I can tell him apart from any neighborhood stray. I'm familiar with being cautious of baby cries outside your door at night because predators have been known to record them and bait women, essentially weaponizing their maternal instinct. But who does that with a cat? For that to work, not only would you have to know that I have a cat, but also somehow gain access to a recording of his crying and play it back for me every night right outside of my window, and not be seen. So, hello nightmare, right? Has anyone else experienced something similar? How did you make it stop? Is this thing's goals just to rob me of sleep and peace of mind, or am I in danger here? Or is it finally time for me to suck up my pride and see somebody because I'm officially going insane? I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania with a dense forest in my backyard, as well as a creek and fresh water spring too. My brother and I would often play away our summers in the woods, running around, but we both can attest to having some weird experiences. Nothing super overt, but just sort of your stereotypical chills or uneasy feeling as if you're being watched. However, when I was around 13 and my brother was 15, we went into the woods like we always did, and at some point we sort of split off. I travelled about maybe a mile along the creek when I heard my brother call for me. There was no panic in his voice, it was super calm, just as if he wanted to talk to me about something, or if he found something cool, a rock or a critter or something. I called back asking what he wanted, but his response was just my name, again and again. I began to walk toward the direction of his voice, deeper in the woods, away from the creek and into the brush. I continued calling out again, asking what he wanted, but his response was always just my name, in the same tone and pitch. Then, suddenly, someone grabbed my shoulder, and when I turned, it was my brother. I asked him what he needed, and he looked at me confused. "You were calling me, so I came to find you," he said. I responded that he had been the one calling for me, and I was walking to him. He said that he hadn't called for me at all at this point, and I pointed to the direction that I had heard his voice, and he responded that he had never even gone in that direction, keeping to the creek side like I had. I was inclined to believe him too, as I had heard his voice come from deep in the woods where there was thick brush filled with thorn bushes and not many walkable deer trails, and he had approached me from behind, which was the direction of the creek. My brother and I decided that we were going to head in for the day after this experience, and we avoided the woods for months after this too. It's by far the creepiest experience that I've ever had. A few years back, I went camping with two buddies in the mountains near Lake Tahoe. We hiked about 2 hours with our packs to a small lake and set up camp. All was normal during the day, and we made some hot dogs and beans. Then we stayed up until it was dark to watch the stars at night. Once it was dark, we hiked up to the top of a large boulder to sort of get a bit of a vantage point to see the stars over the trees. I recall that there was no moon out that night because we could see the stars so clearly due to the limited ambient light. And we were pretty far out, so there's no background noise or light from humans. And once your eyes adjusted, after maybe half an hour or so, we could see all the stars and even some satellites slowly moving in the sky. It's very dark out without the moon, and that will be important later, so keep it in mind. So, after we're done stargazing, we head down to our tents set up right by the lake. We have two two-person tents for the three of us. My two friends shared one tent and I was alone in the other one. We set up the tents right next to each other in the same flat spot. I fall asleep pretty easily because I was tired from hiking and exploring all day and because it was so dark. I like sleeping in the dark though. However, at about maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, I wake up to a rustling noise outside of my tent. In my half sort of asleep daze, I'm really not sure if it's just wind or something else. I keep listening and I realize that it's something brushing against my tent, and it sounds like maybe an animal is pushing its nose against the tent fabric and sniffing. The sound is coming from the side of the tent right next to my head, so I can hear it super clearly. At this point, my heart is racing and I'm lying frozen in my sleeping bag, hoping that whatever is outside will leave my tent and it'll be over quickly. I think about calling out to my friends in their tent, but I don't want to startle or anger whatever is outside, so I decide to just keep lying still and hope that it will leave. My mind is going through every possibility, and then I finally realize what it is. When we had set up our tents earlier in the day, there wasn't much flat space, so we placed our tents very close to each other. Evidently, they were so close that when my friend was moving his feet in his sleeping bag, they brushed up against his tent, all which was right near my head. So all along it was my friend's feet moving around and there was no animal or person outside. That was a huge relief. However, the weird stuff doesn't stop there, and I only realized that this next part was weird once we had left the next day and I got home. You see, as I laid in my tent and tried to slow my heart after realizing the rustling was just my friend, I was looking at the shadows of the trees on the walls of my tent. That reminded me sort of as a kid when a car would slowly drive down your street and the headlights through the blinds could cast shadow that slowly drew across your ceiling. At the time, it made sense to me, and I thought it was just like when I was a kid. Considering that I had just thought a creature was outside my tent, this seemed like nothing. However, as I mentioned earlier, it was completely dark and moonless, so what could that light have been? It was a very slow-drawing light that had the shadows of the trees moving slowly across my tent walls for about 5 minutes. We were really far from civilization, so there is no way that it was a car or flashlight from a midnight hiker because the light was so steady and slow-moving. Could it have been a flare in the sky or a comet streaking across the dark, starry sky? I suppose so, but really, I don't think it was that. I mean, something that far away really doesn't seem to account for the strength in the shadows, if you catch my drift. In any case, I still don't know what it could have been, and I only ever realized it after that I had gotten home and left the campsite that night was a really weird one.